Hello fellow sapiens, just welcome to Sleepless Homo. If you're here, chances are your brain's still spinning, whether you're trying to fall asleep, cooking something vaguely edible, walking through the rain with headphones in, or just working late and wondering why we ever invented consciousness before coffee. This is long-form, evidence-based history told slowly. No drama, no hype, just deep time, soft science, and a calm voice trying to make sense of the strange decisions our species keeps making. If this kind of storytelling helps you, whether to wind down, focus, or simply not feel alone at 2 a.m, I'd love if you liked the video and subscribed. It really does help more people find this kind of quiet content in a loud world. And if you want to share how you use it, before bed, while driving, cleaning, zoning out at the gym, or whatever your ritual is, drop a comment. Or let me know where in the world you're listening from. Also, if you drift off somewhere along the way, don't worry. I've put timestamps in the description so you can pick up where you left the story the next day. Because this one's worth hearing from start to end. This isn't a channel for wild theories or cinematic reenactments. I'm just one human doing my best to tell these stories honestly, using archaeology, genetics, and whatever scraps of memory our species left behind. I don't have all the answers, but I'll always be honest about what we do know, and what we probably never will, and as always, stay curious, stay calm. Let's begin. Today's story is the complete origins of war, why we started killing each other. From 500,000 BCE to 3000 BCE, I'll walk you through the quiet evolution of violence, from scattered bones and stone points to fortified towns and missing men. This is not the history of battles. It's the story of something older. Let's go back. If war is ancient, what came before it? Can violence exist without war, without generals, without flags, or even without language? The bones suggest something strange. The more we look back, the more we see signs of conflict. But there is a line we cannot cross, a point where the trail disappears. Before tactics, before territory, before even humans as we know them, there was still violence, not war, but something older. A sharp shove in the dark, a bite, a scream, a group that didn't come back. And to understand when war began, we have to first ask when we started hurting each other on purpose. Around 2 million years ago, something was happening in Africa that would never be undone. The landscape was transforming, forests were shrinking, open grasslands were expanding across the continent, reshaping the way life competed. It wasn't just climate, it was ecology, pressure, energy. Trees meant safety, open ground meant exposure, and exposure required strategy. The hominins of this time, what we would now call early Homo species, like Homo habilis or early Homo erectus, were facing a new kind of evolutionary game. A game that rewarded cooperation, memory, and more than anything else, the ability to recognize who belonged and who didn't. No one was building armies, but they were building bonds. Within the group, protection meant access to food, mates, safety, and maybe even care. Between groups, things were not always so friendly. To track how far back conflict goes, researchers have spent decades studying our closest living relatives. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because the deeper we look into chimpanzees, not the soft zoo kind, but the wild, territorial, brutally strategic version found in places like Gombe or Ngogo, the more we see the seeds of what could become war. In the forests of eastern Central Africa, wild chimpanzees live in what primatologists call fission-fusion societies. That means they form flexible, shifting subgroups, often gathering in larger bands or splitting off in smaller units to forage. But the larger social structure holds. Each community has a core territory, and when they cross into another group's range, things can turn violent. In one of the most haunting observations ever recorded, primatologist Jane Goodall documented a pattern of coordinated lethal attacks by chimpanzees against neighbouring males. These weren't random fights, they were ambushes. A group of males would travel silently into rival territory. If they found a lone individual, they attacked with terrifying force. No food was taken, no resources were claimed, and the violence was intentional, targeted, and repeated. In the Ngogo community in Uganda's Kibale National Park, researchers tracked a long-term campaign of such attacks over more than a decade. One group of chimpanzees expanded their territory by killing off male rivals, and eventually absorbing part of the defeated community's range. This expansion led to increased access to fruit trees and reproductive females. If this sounds suspiciously strategic, that's because it is. But it is not war, at least not by any formal human definition. There were no written declarations, no alliances, no symbols, just a primal calculus. More land, more food, more mates, more survival, and fewer enemies. So what do we call this? Some scholars argue this is proto-warfare. Others insist we shouldn't project human categories onto chimpanzee behaviour. But what matters is the pattern. The group acts, the individual suffers, there is motive, execution, and benefit, and above all there is memory. These aren't accidental skirmishes. They are acts with consequences. In some ways, they reveal what violence looks like when stripped of ideology or politics, what it looks like when it's just strategy and flesh. Now, if this kind of intergroup aggression exists in chimpanzees, what about in our early ancestors? Can we see traces of it in the fossil record? The truth is, almost not at all. The deeper into the past we go, the fewer bones we have, and the harder it becomes to identify cause of death. We don't have battlefield cemeteries from 2 million years ago. We have scattered jaws, broken skulls, a few teeth, and most of them are badly weathered, crushed or incomplete. But occasionally a hint emerges, a fracture here, a healed wound there, nothing conclusive, nothing like the slaughter pits of the later Neolithic, but enough to suggest that the line between survival and violence was already being drawn in the Pleistocene dirt. In South Africa's Sterkfontein caves, some hominin fossils, possibly Australopithecus or early Homo, show cranial damage that some researchers believe could be the result of interpersonal violence. Others argue it was predation, or falling rocks, or post-mortem breakage. The truth is, we don't know, and that's the problem with early prehistory. It resists certainty. We see the hints, but not the story. Not yet. What we can say is that by around 1.8 million years ago, with the rise of Homo erectus, things were changing. This was a species with a larger brain, a more human-like body plan, and a new kind of social structure. They moved in groups, they hunted, they ranged far beyond the forests, and they spread from Africa into Eurasia in one of the most successful migrations in mammalian history. But with mobility came pressure, territory, competition, and increasingly the need to defend what you had. At this stage, it's likely that most conflict remained informal. A confrontation over water, a fight over a carcass, a standoff between groups that ended with threats, noise, or the occasional deadly encounter. But these encounters wouldn't have looked like war. There were no formations, no leaders issuing commands, just flashes of tension where survival instincts collided. What shaped this behaviour? Part of the answer lies in dominance hierarchies. Among social primates, including baboons, macaques and chimpanzees, hierarchies structure everything. Access to mates, to food, to shelter. And with hierarchies come challenges. Individuals compete for status, coalitions form, allies betray each other, and violence is never far away. For early Homo, these dynamics would have been just as real. Whether through intimidation, ritualized displays, or outright force, some individuals likely used aggression to rise, or fell because of it. But this was still personal violence, not collective war. Even within the group, aggression could be deadly. Among chimpanzees, infanticide is disturbingly common, and among humans this behaviour leaves even fewer traces but may have been present. If a male took over a group, eliminating the offspring of his predecessor could ensure his genes spread faster. These patterns are not unique to humans, but they hint at a truth we often ignore, that violence is not an invention, it is a capacity, one that can be directed, structured or suppressed, but not erased. The environment played a role too. Periods of drought, resource scarcity, and ecological disruption would have placed enormous stress on hominin groups. Scarcity breeds desperation, and desperation can make cooperation fragile. It's possible that some of the earliest deaths were not caused by conflict between groups, but by breakdowns within them. A member who didn't share, a fight over meat, a fatal misunderstanding. And so, for over 1 million years, violence flickered at the edges of hominin life. Not constant, not organised, but always possible. A background condition, sometimes reactive, sometimes strategic, but always lurking just beneath the surface of cooperation. So where does that leave us? If chimpanzees can coordinate attacks, and early Homo lived in social groups under ecological pressure, then how do we define the line between instinctive aggression and war? Is it tactics, symbols, memory? Or maybe war is not defined by what we do, but by what we remember. Violence becomes war when it becomes a story, when it has context, when it shapes how a group sees itself and its enemies. And in this period, from around 2 million to 500,000 years ago, there were no stories, no writing, no monuments, just fractured bones, scattered tools, and long-gone paths through ancient grass. The ghosts of decisions we may never fully understand, but the question still hangs in the air. If war wasn't here yet, then what was it waiting for? Did mastering fire make us more peaceful or more dangerous? It's a question that still burns quietly behind the timeline of our evolution, because something shifted between 500,000 and 300,000 years ago. Something invisible but irreversible. Fire didn't just cook our food, it changed how we saw the night. It changed how we saw each other, and maybe, just maybe, it changed how we handled fear, conflict, and the possibility of power. Fire is not a tool in the way a stone is. It cannot be held, only tended. It cannot be shaped, only guided. And yet it may be the oldest weapon we ever used, not against animals, but against each other. To understand how, we have to return to a world that had never known it, a world before hearths, before warmth, before controlled light. For millions of years, fire belonged to lightning and volcanoes. It was a spectacle, a danger, something to avoid. And then, sometime in the deep lower Paleolithic, someone stopped running from it. The earliest signs of fire use by hominins go back even earlier than this. Sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa show traces of ash and burned bone that may date to as far back as 1 million years ago. But by 500,000 years ago, fire was no longer an occasional accident. It was a presence. At places like Gesher Beno Yaakov in the Jordan Valley, archaeologists have found charred wood, burnt flint artifacts, and thermally altered seeds. Clear signs that fire was being used regularly and deliberately. What does this mean for violence? At first glance, nothing. But fire is never just fire. It is a centre, a symbol, a claim. Once a group has fire, they have a place, a boundary. Other animals keep away. Predators hesitate, and rival humans must now reckon with something more than just numbers. A campfire at night is a signal. We are here, we are awake, we are not alone. In this way, fire becomes territorial, not by design perhaps, but by consequence. It is a marker of control. And where there is control, there is something to fight over. But fire also changes cooperation. It brings people together. It lengthens the day. It softens food, making it more digestible. It allows for digestion with fewer calories spent on chewing, possibly supporting the growth of a larger brain. More importantly, it creates the conditions for conversation, for planning, for memory, and possibly for resentment. Imagine a circle of early humans sitting around a fire. One has a better tool, another has more food. Someone speaks more, someone listens less. Someone looks at the flames and wonders how long this balance will hold. With fire, we gained time, and time lets grievances ferment. What about weapons? This period sees the spread of the Acheulean and early Middle Paleolithic tool traditions. Hand axes become more symmetrical, flakes become sharper. There is evidence that wooden spears, like those found at Schöningen in what is now Germany, were being used to hunt large game as early as 400,000 years ago. These spears were over 2 meters long, sharpened at one end and carefully balanced. Not thrown, likely used for close thrusting, but close is close. And when a tool is that effective at piercing a mammoth, it doesn't take much to imagine what it would do to a rival. Still, there is no direct evidence from this period of those weapons being used on other humans, no skeletons with spear wounds, no mass burials. But this absence might not mean peace. It may just mean impermanence. Bodies left in open air rot fast. Bones scatter. Violence leaves fewer traces than cooperation, ironically, because it often interrupts the process of burial and preservation. So we are left with tools that could kill, and no proof that they did. Yet the psychological landscape was shifting. Fire brought predictability. Tools brought power. And somewhere between the warmth and the edge of the camp, a new idea may have taken shape. That control was possible. Control of food, of mates, of territory, of others. Some anthropologists have suggested that fire itself might have been a factor in social enforcement. That is, once fire was central to group survival, those who misused it, or failed to tend it, may have faced consequences. Did early Homo punish each other for letting the fire die, or for hoarding access to it? We don't know, but the moment something becomes vital, it becomes political. There is also a theory that fire may have helped reduce spontaneous violence. In modern chimpanzees, sudden outbursts of aggression are common. In bonobos, they are rarer. One difference? Bonobos have more stable food supplies and social structures that emphasize bonding. In early humans, fire could have played a similar role. It centralized group activity, it created warmth and safety, reducing external stressors, and it allowed for longer periods of socialization. In this view, fire is a peacekeeper, a force that encourages storytelling, bonding, even empathy. But there's a darker mirror to that theory. The more a group bonds around a fire, the more defined its borders become, United States, and not us. Group identity strengthens, outsiders become more other. The fire unites, but it also divides. Once a group sees itself as distinct, it can begin to think strategically about others. Who gets to join, who does not, and what happens if someone takes your fire away. Gesher Benot Yaakov is often cited not just for its evidence of fire, but for what surrounds it. Thousands of flint tools, animal bones, and hints of organised activity. It is one of the earliest sites where the spatial patterning of finds suggests something approaching a camp. Different zones for different tasks, a structured use of space. And in that structure we see intention. Groups were planning, coordinating, and managing resources. And where there is planning, there is often competition. Some scholars believe that fire made humans more cooperative, but only within the group. Between groups, it may have increased tension. If one group has fire and another does not, what happens? Is it shared, stolen, fought over? Do we even know if groups from this time were stable enough to compete? Or were these loose bands, shifting constantly, meeting only by chance? Again, the record is silent. But evolutionary theory suggests that as resource control increases, so too does the likelihood of conflict. And fire is a resource that cannot be left unguarded. You must tend it, protect it, choose who has access. That means some form of social control, possibly even dominance. It's also worth noting that with fire came night vision. Not literal, but social. The day no longer ended at dusk. Activities could continue into the dark. This changes everything. Hunting, carving, storytelling, even punishment. Night no longer belonged to predators alone, and with that came new possibilities. Not all of them kind. Some theorists have gone further, suggesting that fire enabled a new kind of psychological distance. With flames between them, early humans could observe each other more carefully. Emotions become easier to read in firelight. Expressions flicker, eyes shine. Maybe this allowed for greater empathy. Or maybe it enabled the first subtle forms of exclusion, a glance, a muttered phrase, a shifting of bodies around the warmth. Fire gathers people, but it also reveals them. What we don't see in this period are clear signs of organised defence. No palisades, no trenches, no layers of burned structures that suggest raids. That comes much later. But this absence doesn't prove innocence. It may just mean that conflict was still small-scale, personal, a fight over food, a grudge that ended in silence, nothing dramatic enough to be fossilised, and so we return to the question, did fire make us safer, or more dangerous? It seems the answer is both. It increased cooperation, allowed for planning, and possibly suppressed some impulsive violence. But it also created hierarchy, scarcity, identity, and maybe even the first embers of strategic exclusion. What about weapons? There is no single invention moment. A pointed stick becomes a spear only when aimed. A stone becomes a weapon only when intention crosses the hand. But this period gave us that possibility. The tools were sharp, the muscles were ready, and the brains were growing fast. Between 500,000 and 300,000 years ago, something happened in the human mind. A shift, not in morality, but in memory. in the ability to link past actions with future outcomes, in the capacity to hold a grudge, or to forgive, or to prepare. And that may be the most dangerous technology of all, foresight. Once a group can imagine a future in which their rivals are weaker, or gone entirely, they can begin to plan for it. Even if they never act on it, the possibility's there, flickering, like a fire in the dark. So perhaps fire did not invent violence, but it gave us a new frame to see it through. It gave us time to think, and once we could think, we could remember who wronged us, and we could decide whether to wait. What changed us more, the warmth of the flame, or the shadows it cast? Can you have murder without war? Can someone be killed for reasons we'll never know, in a world that left no witnesses, no laws, and no written memory? What does prehistoric violence look like when it leaves only a single wound, and a silence that lasted for 100,000 years? Between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, the world was not at war. But it was not peaceful either. There were no empires, no armies, no permanent villages, but there were people, real, thinking people, who lived and died in a world shaped by shifting alliances, resource scarcity, and emotional lives as deep and complex as ours. And in that space, where memory disappears but trauma lingers in the bones, we find some of the earliest clues that humans could be deadly, even without being organised. By this point in human evolution, something was already different. The brains were bigger, the bodies were modern. Homo sapiens as a species had begun to appear in eastern and southern Africa, while other hominins, sometimes closely related, still populated parts of Europe and Asia. These humans made tools, controlled fire, buried their dead, and began to shape their landscapes with growing precision. But among the broken bones and scattered campsites, archaeologists have also found something else: injuries, lesions, healed trauma, and sometimes wounds that never healed at all. One of the clearest examples of possible interpersonal violence from this period is a skeleton known as Shanidar III. Discovered in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan in the Zagros Mountains, this individual was an adult male Neanderthal who lived sometime between 60 and 35,000 years ago. His remains were found in a cave with several others, many of whom showed signs of burial. But what makes Shanidar III different is not just the context, it's the wound. A small, precisely angled lesion in one of his ribs, the kind of injury consistent with a projectile, possibly a spear, possibly thrown. The angle of the puncture has led some researchers to suggest that the weapon came from a distance, not a hunting accident, not a self-inflicted wound, but a deliberate strike. Was it murder? Was it a fight? Was it an ambush? Or was it something else? An accident between neighbours, a misunderstanding between groups, or a conflict over resources that got out of hand? We don't know, and we may never know. But the wound is there, and it did not heal. Whoever threw that spear, if it was a spear, left no message, only the consequence. But we must be careful here. Shanidar III is often overinterpreted. He may not even fall neatly within the timeline of this period, as the dating of the site spans tens of thousands of years. More importantly, one case does not make a pattern. What makes this era so frustrating and so fascinating is how rarely violence speaks clearly. Most human remains from this time are partial: a skull fragment, a jawbone, a few teeth. And even when we do find complete skeletons, most show no signs of trauma. Does that mean violence was rare? Or does it mean that the kinds of violence practiced then rarely left a mark? It is easier to kill someone with a stone than with a spear. It is easier to push someone than to stab them. If a person disappears in the forest, there are no headlines, no autopsies, just another missing body in a world full of predators and cliffs. And so the violence of this period may be under the surface, hidden not just by time, but by the sheer difficulty of detecting intention in broken bones. Still, some patterns do emerge. In sub-Saharan Africa, archaeological sites from this era show evidence of complex tool use and landscape management. Humans were living in organised bands, possibly with territories, resource zones, and seasonal migrations. When groups like this encounter each other, the outcome can be trade or tension. We know from later periods that even simple foraging bands can be fiercely protective of their land. It is not unreasonable to assume that disputes happened, that individuals were killed, that someone crossed a line and paid for it. But these were not wars. They were incidents. In Europe and Western Asia, other hominins, including Neanderthals and possibly Denisovans, inhabited the landscape. Did they meet Homo sapiens at this time? Probably not yet. But within their own populations there is growing evidence of trauma. A study of Neanderthal remains across Europe found that a surprisingly high percentage showed signs of healed injuries, mostly to the head and upper body. Some were clearly hunting accidents. Others may have come from interpersonal conflict. Blows to the face, fractures, repeated damage that suggests more than one unlucky day. Among early Homo sapiens, the picture is just as murky. Sites like Omo Kibish in Ethiopia and Jebel Irhoud in Morocco provide fossil evidence of early modern humans going back as far as 300,000 years. But the remains are fragmentary. Most are incomplete skulls, making it difficult to assess cause of death or presence of violence. What we do see is increasing anatomical modernity, a face like ours, a brain like ours, a body capable of anything we've done since. And that alone raises the question, if the hardware was there, was the software already capable of murder? Perhaps the most striking thing about violence in this period is how unorganized it is. There are no mass graves, no clear battlefield contexts, no signs of systematic killing. What we find instead are hints. A single, cracked bone, a punctured skull, a healed fracture. Enough to whisper, but not to explain. One particularly telling case comes from the site of Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain. This site, which predates our target timeline slightly, contains the remains of at least 28 individuals from a common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. One skull, known as Cranium 17, bears two closely spaced fractures to the forehead. Both were likely made by the same object. Both occurred around the time of death, and neither could have been accidental. The implication is chilling. Someone hit this person twice in the face, possibly with a club or sharp-edged tool. Not in war, not in chaos, but in close quarters, up close, face to face. Even more haunting is what surrounds the skull. The site itself is a deep vertical shaft accessible only through a long tunnel. The bodies appear to have been placed there deliberately. Whether as burial or disposal is unclear, but they were not scavenged. They were not scattered. And this suggests something new: memory, intention, ritual perhaps, or at the very least, respect, even for the dead who met a violent end. What does this tell us? That murder may have existed long before war, that violence did not require nations or armies or ideology. All it needed was fear, or desire, or rage, or confusion, and a hand that didn't stop in time. Across this entire span, from 300,000 to 100,000 years ago, humans were learning to live together in larger, more stable groups. They were building knowledge, passing down tool traditions, managing fire, and maybe even beginning to shape the earlier symbolic behaviours. But they were also human, which means they were capable of hurt. What about psychological evidence? Of course, we can't see thoughts in the fossil record. But some anthropologists argue that this period marks the deepening of emotional and social awareness, empathy, shame, grief. And with these came new vulnerabilities: jealousy, betrayal, revenge. These emotions are not modern, they are old, possibly older than language. And where they live, violence is never far. But again, no armies, no formations, just people, living in caves, under trees, by rivers, sometimes alone, sometimes surrounded, and sometimes hurt in ways that the bones almost forgot to remember. So what are we left with? A strange quiet. A long chapter of human history where people could kill, but did not yet coordinate. Where injury meant conflict, but not conquest. Where death was sudden, but not strategic. And perhaps most importantly, where the line between accident, punishment, and murder is still almost impossible to draw. But the wounds are there, not many, not always clear, but just enough to remind us that war is not the beginning of violence, it is only its organisation. And long before war, we were already learning what it meant to lose someone, not to nature, but to each other. So the question remains, how many of our ancestors died not because of the world around them, but because of the humans beside them? And how many more will never be found? Was there a prehistoric Cold War between species? Not a war of empires or declarations or flags, but something quieter, slower, a territorial stalemate that lasted tens of thousands of years. Two kinds of human, walking the same valleys, drinking from the same rivers, but rarely, if ever, trusting each other enough to share the fire. Between 250,000 and 40,000 years ago, the story of war still had no name. But the ingredients were all on the table. By now, Neanderthals had spread across Europe and parts of Western Asia, from the Atlantic coast to the Caucasus Mountains. Homo sapiens, newly emerging in Africa, had begun to appear in the Levant, a narrow contested corridor where continents and climates meet. For thousands of years, the two species may have stood on either side of a line invisible to the Earth, but very real in the bones of their survival. This wasn't yet a world of armies, but it was a world of limits. Ice Age climates meant that much of northern Europe was uninhabitable for long stretches. Habitable zones were small, rich, and fiercely local. River valleys, sheltered caves, coastal flats, the kinds of places where food, shelter, and fresh water aligned. And where those alignments existed, Neanderthals had already dug in. For over 200,000 years, Neanderthals adapted to these environments with astonishing precision. Their bodies were short and broad, their bones thick, their musculature massive. Everything about them suggested close-quarter survival. They hunted large animals like aurochs and woolly rhinoceros with wooden thrusting spears. They controlled fire, butchered game, and fashioned sophisticated tools from flint and bone. Their society was small-scale but stable. Bands of perhaps 10 to 20 individuals, seasonally mobile, socially bonded. They buried their dead. They may have cared for their injured, and they knew their landscapes with a memory that ran deeper than migration. Then, sometime around 180,000 years ago, something new appeared at the edge of their world. Homo sapiens. Probably not in force, probably not for long. But the Levant begins to show traces of our kind, anatomically modern humans, in sites like Skul and Kafze in what is now Israel and Palestine. These humans came from Africa, likely through Sinai, riding waves of favourable climate that opened green corridors where deserts usually ruled. But they didn't stay. For tens of thousands of years, the presence of Homo sapiens in the Levant seems to blink in and out, like a signal struggling to hold. They arrive, they leave, Neanderthals return, then they too are gone, back and forth, a shifting tide of hominin presence, with no clear pattern and no obvious contact. Or is there? The archaeological record rarely gives us confrontation, but it does give us overlap. Layered sediments in caves like Kibara and Taban show alternating phases of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens occupation, sometimes with long gaps, sometimes with none. Did they see each other? Did they compete? Did they fight? We don't know. But it is not unreasonable to imagine that two species, so close in ecological niche, so close in anatomy, would not pass each other in silence. They hunted the same game, they used the same water sources, they built fires in the same shelters, and they likely viewed each other not as exotic beings, but as rival animals. Strange, similar, but not kin. Was it always hostile? Not necessarily. The most probable scenario is complex. Avoidance, tension, moments of tolerance, then disappearance. Because neither species seemed able to push the other out completely, and at least not yet. The Levant, that narrow corridor, becomes something like a buffer zone, a no-man's land of prehistory. The idea that early contact zones were Cold War environments is not just metaphorical. In military history, a Cold War is defined by the absence of open conflict and the constant presence of strategic posturing, a standstill with stakes, and in this case, the stakes were survival, not just for individuals but for entire lineages. Some researchers have speculated, cautiously, that the relative stasis in this region may reflect a balance of power, that Neanderthals, knowing their terrain, held the uplands and valleys, while early Homo sapiens, newer to the region, stuck to coastal plains or marginal zones. When climates shifted, corridors opened or closed, and with them the rhythm of contact. We have no battlefields, no defensive structures, no weapons embedded in bones, but we have proximity, and proximity is never neutral. Even in modern primates, neighbouring groups often engage in cautious avoidance, punctuated by sudden aggression. Border patrols, defensive postures, competitive displays. Among chimpanzees, this behaviour can escalate into lethal raids. Among gorillas, it tends to remain bluster. Among humans, it depends. One of the most compelling pieces of indirect evidence for territorial tension comes from raw material sourcing. Both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens made tools from specific types of stone, often carried over long distances. In several contact zone sites, we see tool industries that seem distinct, different flaking techniques, different patterns of retouch. This may reflect cultural boundaries, or it may reflect a quiet rule. Do not cross into their territory, not because you will be killed, but because you will not be welcome. Some anthropologists refer to this as non-violent conflict, a spatial grammar of competition. You don't need war when avoidance works, when each group knows the limits of its reach. But that doesn't mean it's peace. It just means the cost of confrontation outweighed the reward. Until it didn't. This era also includes the expansion of Homo sapiens across North Africa and into Western Asia. Climate records suggest that brief wet periods allowed migration routes to open between the Nile and the Arabian Peninsula. Each pulse may have brought small groups of humans into Neanderthal-adjacent areas. Each pulse may have frayed the edges of that quiet border just a little more. What about inside-group conflict among Neanderthals themselves? Here too, the record is sparse but suggestive. Injuries to Neanderthal skulls, especially frontal trauma, appear in a significant number of specimens. Some are clearly accidents, hunting mishaps, falls, but others may reflect interpersonal violence, blunt force trauma, defensive wounds, healed fractures, not war, but not peace either, just the messy spectrum of primate behaviour, of emotions, hierarchy and proximity. There is one more theory worth mentioning, not as fact but as a possibility, that in certain areas Neanderthals may have outnumbered Homo sapiens but lacked the demographic or organisational flexibility to respond to new competition, that what looks like coexistence may have actually been a slow, creeping replacement, not through war, but through encroachment, territory by territory, cave by cave. Until one morning, the fire in the next valley wasn't a cousin's, it was a stranger's, and they didn't leave. But even this is speculation, and speculation, in the absence of evidence, is something this story cannot afford. So we are left with this: two human species, nearly 250,000 years of parallel existence, sometimes near, sometimes far, possibly never friendly, possibly never openly violent, but always aware on some level that they were not alone, that the night fire in the hills could mean another band, another face, another shadow walking the same trail home, and that may be the deepest root of war, not hatred, but ambiguity, not conquest, but uncertainty, when the line between friend and rival blurs, when you do not know whether the ones across the valley will trade with you, or take what you have. The Neanderthal story is not over. It will continue, with extinction, with interbreeding, with ghost DNA that still echoes in our blood. But that comes later. For now, all we know is this: there was space, there was time, there was contact, and there was tension. Whether that tension ever exploded into violence remains one of the oldest cold cases in human history. When did humans start thinking in tribes? Not fighting them, not fearing them, just knowing they were there, the ones who were not us, the ones whose beads were the wrong shape, whose ochre came from the wrong place, whose faces were not quite right. Between 150,000 and 50,000 years ago, something changed in the way humans saw each other. This was not yet the age of borders or names or nations. There were no maps to draw a line across, but there were lines, all the same, etched into skin, wrapped around wrists, smeared across faces in red ochre and soft ash. Lines that said, "We are this, not that. This is not the story of war, not yet, but it may be the story of its prelude, because before you can fight a stranger you have to recognise them as one." In southern Africa, near the southern tip of what would later be called the continent's cradle, early Homo sapiens were leaving clues, tiny ones. At sites like Blombus Cave, humans began making beads from Nassarius shells, small spiraled mollusks that were carefully perforated, smoothed and strung together. These beads are not food, they are not tools, they are decoration, and that makes them something strange, a message with no practical purpose. The beads at Blombos date to at least 75,000 years ago, though other nearby sites may push that number further. They're often stained with red ochre, a pigment made from iron-rich clay, and show signs of prolonged wear. These were not casual ornaments. They were worn again and again. They meant something. But what? Some anthropologists argue that personal ornamentation is the earliest form of identity signalling. A way to say, I am part of this group, without needing to speak. Beads and pigments may have functioned like early passports. Not official, of course, but socially powerful. You wore your status, you marked your affiliations, and in doing so, you created the first fragile barrier between us and them. That doesn't mean it was hostile. Difference is not the same as division, but it does mean that humans were paying attention, not just to the natural world around them, but to the symbolic one they were building. A world of markers, meanings, and subtle rules about what it meant to belong. Elsewhere in Africa, the same pattern emerges. At Pinnacle Point, at Sibudu, at Deep Kloof Rock Shelter. Humans were collecting ochre, engraving geometric shapes on stones and bones, and experimenting with pigment mixtures that could adhere to skin, hide, or fibre. Some even appear to have developed compound adhesives, a blend of ochre and plant resin, that hints at both chemistry and intention. These mixtures may have been used to haft tools, but also possibly to mark bodies. We don't know the exact meanings, we never will. But the precision with which these pigments were gathered, processed and applied suggests more than utility. It suggests memory, ritual, recognition. By the time humans began expanding into Eurasia, sometime between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, they brought these symbolic capacities with them. In the Levant at sites like Skul and Kafze, burials include ochre-stained bones and shell ornaments that mirror the southern African tradition. In Central Asia and parts of Eastern Europe, later Homo sapiens sites continue the practice. Beads, pendants, even etched ivory. These were mobile humans, walking thousands of kilometres across new and dangerous terrain. But they carried meaning with them. Why does this matter? Because meaning builds boundary. When groups share symbols, colours, patterns, materials, they form in-groups. When others lack those symbols or use them differently, the distinction becomes visible. The cognitive shift required to recognise symbolic difference may be one of the most profound in human evolution. It turns culture into code, and code into caution. In modern hunter-gatherer societies, even small differences in adornment can signal lineage, alliance, marital status, or ritual role. Face paint is not just art. It is a story, a password, a warning. And once that kind of signalling exists, the ability to recognise outsiders follows, sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with curiosity, but rarely without reaction. So when did this capacity arise? There's no exact date. No eureka moment where someone rubbed ochre on their cheek and started a cultural revolution. But the evidence clusters around the late Middle Stone Age and the early Upper Paleolithic, roughly 150,000 to 50,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens began to display an increasing tendency towards symbolic behaviour, abstract thought, and group cohesion. Not just making tools, but making meaning. In Europe, a parallel story unfolds. Neanderthals, once thought incapable of symbolism, are now understood to have engaged in at least some forms of adornment. They collected feathers, they modified shells. At one site in Spain, Cueva de los Aviones, perforated shells stained with pigment have been dated to over 115,000 years ago. If correct, this would place symbolic behaviour in Neanderthals before it appeared in Homo sapiens. But even if the dating is revised, the pattern remains. The line between these species was not a line of intelligence, it was a line of expression. What's important is not who did it first, but that both did it at all, which means that identity was already evolving. Even children were likely involved. Bead-making requires fine motor skills and attention, but not great strength. The presence of small, child-sized ornaments in some burials suggests that these symbolic systems were learned early, passed down, reinforced. Group identity became something inherited, not genetically, but socially. And that is the foundation of every human culture that followed. The emergence of identity does not mean the emergence of hostility, but it plants the seed, because once you recognise that you are one thing and they are something else, then the stage is set, not for conflict, not necessarily, but for judgment. And judgment changes everything. We do not know if early humans judged others harshly. They may have been open, flexible, generous. But we do know that the symbolic mind has a tendency to group, to sort, to trust those who mirror us, to fear those who do not. These are ancient instincts, not evil, not wrong, just part of the way the human brain tries to survive complexity, by reducing it, by labelling, by learning who is safe, and when resources are scarce, when the rains fail or the herds move. Those labels can harden, but again, no weapons here, no battles, just beads, pigments, and the quiet birth of social memory. One of the most famous finds from this era comes from the site of Border Cave in South Africa. Among the artefacts are carved bone points, shells, and what may be a form of early counting stick. The tools suggest long-term planning. The ornaments suggest meaning. The combination suggests a culture not just surviving, but narrating itself, saying, "We are this. We have always been this. We will pass this on." That may be the most profound moment in the prehistory of conflict, not when someone threw the first stone, but when someone looked across a river and thought, "They are not us," not because of danger, not because of violence, just because of the colours they wore, the patterns they chose, the meanings they carried that did not belong to you, and from that thought, everything else becomes possible, not inevitable, just possible. So we end here, with no fighting, no screaming, just a human sitting by a fire, stringing beads together, maybe for beauty, maybe for pride, maybe for a story only their people told. And on the far side of the valley, another group doing the same, different beads, different fire. No words exchanged, not yet, but someday one group would cross that valley, and someone would wonder, should we welcome them, or should we not? Were there ambushes before there were battles? Did the first raids begin not with drums or strategies, but with a single stone thrown from behind a tree, a quiet movement through the brush, the decision, made together or not at all, to take something from someone who would not give it freely? Between 50,000 and 20,000 years ago, the world was colder. This was the heart of the late Pleistocene, an age of glaciers and megafauna and long, slow human dispersals. But beneath the climate records and migration models, something more personal begins to appear. A subtle pattern in the bones, not everywhere, not all the time, but in certain places and on certain skeletons, there are signs that people were not only dying, they were being killed, together. Most of the evidence is sparse, but that's to be expected. For this time period, nearly every archaeological site is a miracle of survival. Most remains are fragmentary, many have no context. We're looking at whispers in a storm. But when you line them up, a shape begins to form, and the shape looks less like chaos and more like retaliation. Let's start in North Africa. Along the Nile corridor, scattered burials from the late Pleistocene show a curious frequency of traumatic injuries. Not in every case, not even in most, but in enough to suggest something more than accident. In particular, patterns of embedded projectile points, flint fragments lodged in ribs, vertebrae or limbs, point to intentional harm. One person falling on a spear might be unlucky, but 5 from different layers and years in the same position. That begins to stretch coincidence. Even more telling is the clustering. When we find injuries on the front of the body, it's tempting to imagine combat, face to face, whether by confrontation or surprise. When the trauma is to the back or side, it implies something else. Ambush. A strike before defense is mounted, possibly from distance, possibly from someone you never even saw. This kind of violence is not yet war, but it is not random. It suggests intent, planning, maybe even group coordination, a decision to harm, to take, to push someone else back, and it may not have been one-sided. In some regions, notably parts of what is now Sudan and the Horn of Africa, repeated use of certain territories implies a cyclical pattern of reoccupation. If these areas held water or seasonal game, they would have been valuable, and in a glacial world, value often meant pressure. One group leaves, another enters, then the first returns, to find their shelter burned or their kin gone. It does not take civilization to feel the heat of revenge. It only takes memory. Archaeologists sometimes refer to this as retaliatory raiding, a pattern seen in some later foraging societies, where acts of violence are not isolated but rhythmic. One attack leads to another. Not for territory, necessarily, but for balance. to restore what was taken, or, more often, to prevent appearing weak. The problem is, most of this evidence comes from the bones of the dead, and the dead don't speak clearly. What we can see are injuries, healed and unhealed, linear fractures on skulls, depressions in long bones, punctures that align suspiciously with spearheads or arrows. In some rare cases there is no healing at all, meaning the injury was fatal or occurred at death. In others, there is evidence of survival. The blow was delivered, the wound closed, and the person lived. For a while. In East Africa, a few lakeside sites show multiple individuals buried in close proximity, with overlapping signs of violence. Some have suggested that these may be early massacre sites, moments where one group was overwhelmed by another. But we must be careful. Without clear stratigraphy, it's difficult to say whether these people died at the same time or across generations. A cluster of injuries is not always a single event. Sometimes it's a pattern spread thin over years. Still, the implication is there. People were dying violently, and not alone. Another thread comes from the study of lithic technology, stone tools. By this period, both Homo sapiens and other human groups had developed increasingly refined projectile points. Some were large, meant for thrusting, others were smaller, designed for speed. In particular, the emergence of microliths, small, sharp stone flakes hafted into composite weapons, allowed for more efficient, accurate projectiles. These were not just for hunting. They could be used on people, and if you had the tools and the motive and a reason to believe they would strike first if you didn't, then what you had was a system, not a war, but a behaviour, one that, given enough generations, might become tradition. This is where the line blurs. In modern hunter-gatherer groups studied ethnographically, the line between personal violence and group retaliation is often fuzzy. A feud over a woman or a stolen item or a past insult can escalate, drawing in kin, allies, and eventually the entire band. Sometimes these conflicts cool, sometimes they end in death. But once the cycle begins, it's hard to stop. There are debts, there are expectations, there is honour. Could similar dynamics have existed among Pleistocene humans? Possibly. We know from dental wear patterns and skeletal isotopes that many groups in this period had high mobility. They were not rooted to one place, but they returned to favoured sites. They may have met the same neighbours again and again, sometimes to trade, sometimes to argue, and in the long dark of an Ice Age night, it is not hard to imagine stories being told, about that group by the lake, about what they did last season, about how they can't be trusted, and stories, as always, are more powerful than spears. What we do not have in this period is structure. No walls, no fortifications, no professional warriors, there are no grave goods that indicate a caste of fighters, no iconography of battle. This is not a military world, it is a social one, where violence, when it comes, is intimate, local, recurring, and that in some ways is more chilling, because it means no one was safe, and no one was exempt. One of the best indicators of this shift comes not from the dead, but from the living, or rather, from how the dead were treated by the living. In several sites from this era, bodies appear to have been carefully buried despite clear signs of trauma. Wounds did not make someone a pariah. They made them something else, maybe a symbol, maybe a warning, maybe a martyr. This shift, towards social memory of violence, is crucial. It means that people were beginning to recognise patterns, to connect events, to remember what had happened, and to act on it. You do not retaliate without a narrative, so this is where we are, in the closing chapters of the Pleistocene, scattered groups of humans, living in changing climates, carrying sharper tools, and beginning, just beginning, to keep score. Still no walls, still no armies, but maybe, just maybe, a list. And that list, whether scratched on stone or whispered by a fire, was not just about the past, it was about the future. Because once a group expects to be raided, it begins to plan, and once it plans, it prepares, and once it prepares, the storm is no longer gathering, it has already begun. Did war begin in a flooded graveyard? If there was ever a place where the silence of bones might be mistaken for an answer, it's a patch of sand and riverbank in the far north of Sudan, not far from the border with modern Egypt. A site now called Jebel Sahaba. Its layers are shallow, its people were few, but its wounds run deep, and they have been echoing through anthropological debates for nearly half a century. The year was 14,000 before the present. This part of the Nile Valley, known as Nubia, had not yet been swallowed by desert. Back then it was wetter, greener, full of reeds and fish, and the winding memory of a river that had not yet been tamed. The people who lived here were fisher foragers. They moved seasonally. They left behind stone tools, hearths, and traces of meals eaten long ago. And in one spot, just a few metres from the riverbank, they left behind something else, a cemetery. And within it, what some researchers have called the oldest evidence of organised group conflict in human history. When Jebel Sahaba was excavated in the 1960s by Fred Wendorf's team, it sent a tremor through the anthropological world. 61 individuals were uncovered, men, women and children, buried together in shallow pits. Many of them showed signs of trauma, but not the kind that comes from falls or accidents. These were targeted injuries, projectile points embedded in bones, skull fractures, cuts to the forearms and ribs. It looked to early researchers like a massacre, and for decades, that's how it was described. The first battlefield cemetery. Proof that by 14,000 years ago humans were not just capable of interpersonal violence, but of coordinated, possibly sustained conflict between groups. But of course, science rarely holds still. In recent years, new eyes have returned to these ancient wounds. The Belgian anthropologist Benoit Crèvecoeur and his colleagues undertook a detailed reanalysis of the original skeletal remains, using modern imaging, better contextual data, and an updated understanding of how trauma presents in ancient bone. Their findings were striking. Not only did the injuries at Jebel Sahaba show signs of repeated violence, some individuals had evidence of both healed and unhealed wounds, but the distribution of trauma seemed to cluster around certain areas of the body. The upper limbs, the pelvis, the head, defensive wounds, and sometimes execution-like patterns. Even more intriguing was what wasn't there: formal weapons. The stone points embedded in the bodies were simple microliths, the same kinds used in fishing and hunting, but their presence, especially in fragile areas like the cervical vertebrae and eye sockets, suggested they were not stray shots. These had been aimed. Whether in ambush, skirmish, or something closer to ritual, it was clear. People were being deliberately killed. So, what does this mean? Was Jebel Sahaba the first war? It depends on how we define the word. Some scholars argue that the term war should be reserved for large-scale, organised multi-event conflict with formal leadership and strategic goals. Others take a broader view, defining war as any recurring group-based violence carried out by identifiable collectives. Jebel Sahaba in this framing would qualify, not because of its size, but because of its pattern. The trauma isn't random, it's consistent, it spans multiple individuals, and crucially, some of it shows healing. That means survivors, and if there were survivors, there may have been retaliation. What makes this even more compelling is the burial itself. These people were not discarded or left exposed. They were interred carefully, often in extended positions, sometimes with grave goods. That suggests they were mourned, remembered. Their deaths were not just the end of life, they were events that shaped the living. That too may mark a turning point, because war isn't just about killing, it's about memory, about keeping score, about who did what, and what must be done next. Some researchers have suggested that the people buried here were victims of a single violent event, an ambush perhaps, or a failed defence. Others think the trauma points to episodic conflict, small raids, repeated over years or even generations, with casualties slowly accumulating. The truth may lie somewhere in between, a community caught in cycles of seasonal conflict, living always on the edge of danger and eventually overwhelmed by it. There is no clear sign of who the attackers were, no burned structures, no foreign tools, no written threats. But we don't need those to understand the stakes. If two groups were competing for access to Nile floodplain resources, fish runs, freshwater springs, or just secure territory, then tension was inevitable. Add mobility, memory, and identity into the mix, and you don't need generals, just fear, just loss, just the belief that next season they'll come again. Jebel Sahaba may be the first site where archaeologists can trace not just an act of violence, but its echo. The trauma was collective, the burial was deliberate, and the silence around it, the absence of any other known mass site from this period, makes it stand out all the more. A lonely graveyard, a marker of something ancient shifting in the way humans lived and died. But here is where we must pause and admit what cannot yet be proven. We do not know if this was war, not with the certainty that headlines demand. We know that people died from wounds inflicted by other people, that they were buried with care, that some had been wounded before, that the points lodged in their bones were sharp enough to kill. But we do not know the cause, the provocation, the names, the stories. We do not know if this was defense or aggression, if it was one battle or many, if the group buried here was a band of raiders or the victims of one. We do not know who they were angry at, or who they feared. What we do know is this. By 14,000 years ago, human conflict had crossed a threshold. It left behind not just wounded bodies, but wounded communities. Communities who remembered, who buried, who grieved, and that may be the beginning of something else entirely. Because when violence becomes a story, when it leaves the skin and enters the mind, it becomes part of culture. It can be taught, repeated, justified. Jebel Sahaba is not a myth. It is a set of bones in a riverbank held together by nothing but sand and time. But the myth it leaves behind, of enemies, of threats, of people who are not us, may be even older than the grave itself. And so, we ask, did war begin in a flooded graveyard, or did it begin in the silence that followed, when someone looked at the bodies of their kin and thought, we must never let that happen again? Or worse, we must make sure they never do it again. What happens when people stay in one place too long? It sounds like the beginning of a cautionary tale, or maybe just the quiet origin of the modern world. Because before there were borders, before there were armies or agriculture or kings with maps, there was something simpler. There were people, not moving. For most of our species' time on Earth, mobility was survival. Resources moved, so we did too. Herds shifted with the seasons, rivers flooded and receded, fruiting trees ripened and vanished. In this world, ownership was not about the land beneath your feet. It was about memory, pattern, and the ability to find what you needed again. Next spring, next hunt, next moon. But something began to change around 15,000 years ago. Slowly, inconsistently, and not everywhere at once. In certain parts of the world, particularly the Levant, the Upper Nile Valley, and the eastern arc of the Fertile Crescent, human groups began staying put for longer stretches. This wasn't yet full-scale agriculture, not the kind with fields and fences, but it was something in between, a new rhythm, a new relationship to space. They call it sedentism, and it wasn't a single invention. It was a side effect, a byproduct of ecology, abundance, and, oddly enough, success. In the Levant, the Natufian culture gives us some of the earliest archaeological glimpses into this transformation. Around 13,000 years ago, in what is now Israel and Jordan, small stone settlements begin to appear. Circular dwellings dug partly into the earth, pestles, mortars, flint sickles. Not farming exactly, but harvesting, gathering wild cereals in large enough quantities to store, and with storage came the need to guard. It's easy to underestimate how strange this was, evolutionarily speaking. For millions of years, food had been consumed quickly or shared widely. Rotten rivalry kept things moving, but now, for the first time in human history, calories could be accumulated. Dried seeds, roasted nuts, preserved pulses, buried caches, hunger. Once a shared emergency became a private event, and that may have been the beginning of something irreversible. Because when food stays in one place, so do the people who want it. In North Africa, similar patterns emerged along the Nile and into what is now the Sahara during one of its brief green phases. Water levels fluctuated with monsoonal pulses, creating fertile patches that could be used year after year. Fishing intensified. Storage pits became more common, cemeteries grew, but with all of this came tension. Not conflict necessarily, as not yet, but pressure. Because sedentism, unlike mobility, creates boundaries. If you've built a dwelling, dug a granary, buried your dead, that land starts to feel like yours. And if someone else camps too close next season, or takes grain from your pit, or fishes your weir, a line has been crossed, and so, sometime between 15,000 and 9,000 years ago, humans began doing something very new. They began defending invisible lines. There are no walls yet, no fortresses, but in the soil, in the layout of houses, in the tight clusters of burials and hearths and shared storage areas, a new idea is forming. territory, not just space used, but space claimed. It's important to say, this did not happen all at once, or everywhere. Many groups remained mobile, many still do, but where sedentism took root, something began to shift in the psychology of land. It became remembered, mapped in stories, tied to ancestors, measured not just in distance, but in meaning. And once a place means something, to you, to your family, to your dead, it becomes harder to leave, and harder to share. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups have long noted the difference between generalized sharing economies and more territorial models. The Hadza of Tanzania, for example, maintained flexible access to overlapping foraging zones, rarely enforcing exclusive rights. But in other groups, particularly those with seasonal abundance like the Pacific Northwest tribes of North America, salmon runs and nut groves are tightly regulated. Not with fences, but with rules, with memory, with who came first, and this may be the key to understanding the roots of later conflict. Because war does not require cities, or kings, or bronze. It only requires two groups who both believe they have the right to the same place, and the will to prove it. The Natufians, for all their innovations, may have lived in a kind of uneasy balance. Their semi-permanent villages show signs of repeated occupation, but also of periodic abandonment. Some burials are isolated, others tightly packed. There are hints, just hints, of interpersonal violence. A fractured skull here, a healed rib there. Not enough to call war, but enough to suggest friction. Even more revealing are the storage pits, dug deep, lined with stone or clay, hidden beneath house floors. Some are large enough to feed dozens, others are too small to justify. Unless you consider hiding, unless you imagine what it means to store something that another person might want to take. Territory is not just a physical claim, it is a psychological shift, a belief that space can be possessed, and by extension, that people can trespass. Once you have that belief, you don't need maps, you don't need language, you only need memory and a willingness to act. By around 10,000 years ago in the early Neolithic, this shift becomes visible across multiple regions. In the Zagros Mountains, early villages cluster around predictable water sources. In the Nile Valley, seasonal encampments turn into ritual sites. In the Jordan Valley, architectural continuity begins to emerge. House foundations rebuilt in place, generation after generation. This is inheritance, not of tools or names, but of place. And inherited space brings new pressures, not just from outsiders, but within. Once land is passed down, conflict can arise between siblings, between lineages, between clans. Violence need not come from the outside. Sometimes it's over the field next door. Sometimes it's over who gets to plant the fig tree this year. We do not have texts from this time, no records of disputes, no lists of grievances, but we do have bones and houses, and the slow fossilization of a new idea that land has value and that value can be defended. All of this, of course, is hindsight. For those who lived it, there was no manifesto, no declaration that sedentism had arrived. It happened because it could, because the climate was right, the rivers flowed, and the seeds did not rot. But like so many turning points in human history, its consequences were not limited to calories. They touched every part of social life. Who you lived near, who you married, who you buried, and who you feared. And so we return to the question, what happens when people stay in one place too long? They remember, they build, they bury, they define themselves in relation to the land, and eventually in opposition to those who don't. Territory is not born from maps. It is born from memory, from storage, from the feeling that you have shaped a place, and that it, in turn, has shaped you, and once that bond forms, it's only a matter of time before someone tries to test it. The story of war does not begin with rage. It begins with roots, with staying, with the quiet certainty that this place is ours, and that anyone else might be a threat, whether or not we're ready to admit it. What happens when you can kill someone without seeing their face? For most of human evolution, that wasn't an option. Death was up close. It smelled like sweat. It required contact, pressure, timing. A blow from a rock, a thrust of wood, a coordinated rush with stone blades and sharpened antlers. But sometime between 20,000 and 8,000 years ago, That changed. A new kind of death emerged. Distant, silent, fast. And the world never fully went back. This is the story of projectiles, of the strange moment in prehistory when hunting tools became something more, not because anyone designed them to be weapons of war, but because, like so much in evolution, they were simply too useful not to be. Let's begin with the bow. It is almost absurdly difficult to find the origin of the bow and arrow. Wood decays, sinew dissolves, gut strings rot. What we do find are clues, indirect, scattered, suggestive. Stone points small enough to fit arrow shafts, microscopic wear patterns on grooves, hints of hafting resin, and in some rare cases fragments of the weapons themselves, preserved by freak conditions of cold, dryness, or peat. The oldest clear evidence of bow use comes from the site of Stellmore in northern Germany, dating to around 12,000 years ago. Here, archaeologists uncovered pine arrow shafts and barbed points, buried in a peat bog alongside reindeer bones. The kill pattern suggests deliberate targeting, trajectories, practice, not random violence, precision, but that is not necessarily where it began. There are earlier signs, much earlier, that human ancestors were experimenting with projectile technology. In Sibidu Cave in South Africa, microresidue and use-wear analysis on stone points suggests that by around 64,000 years ago, people were mounting small blades onto shafts and launching them with some kind of force multiplier. Whether this was a bow or a spear thrower like the atlatl remains debated, but the intent is clear: distance. Distance changed everything. With thrown weapons, the body no longer needed to close the gap between hunter and prey. This reduced risk. It increased surprise, and most importantly, it introduced the concept of range, a physical buffer between the one who harms and the one who is harmed. In hunting, this was a revolution. A wounded animal no longer had to be chased down and stabbed. It could be brought down in motion before it saw the hunter. This made new game possible. Faster prey, skittish species, herds in open terrain. But in social terms, it opened something else, because if a bow can bring down a deer, it can just as easily bring down a human. Now, this was not yet warfare. There is no evidence of archery-based combat in these early layers, no mass killings, no coordinated raids. But what we begin to see, especially in the Mesolithic layers of Europe and parts of North Africa, are skeletons with injuries that could plausibly be caused by projectile weapons, a point lodged in a rib, a narrow puncture in the spine, healed fractures consistent with slingstones or high-speed impacts. Not many, not enough to infer organised combat, but enough to show that the technology had entered a new phase. One of the key features of the bow and sling is psychological, not physical. It is the removal of reciprocity. In a fistfight, pain is mutual. In close quarters conflict, the threat is symmetrical. You can be hurt just as easily as you can hurt. But with a projectile, that balance tilts. You can kill without immediate consequence. You can escape unseen. You can send a message, or silence one, without ever entering the space of your target. The bow also required planning. Arrows needed to be crafted, stored, protected from moisture. Strings had to be tensioned. Targets had to be tracked and approached from downwind. This wasn't brute violence. It was a skill, a system, and once mastered for game, its use on humans became inevitable. Not from malice, but from utility. Interestingly, the spread of projectile technology was not uniform. In some regions, it arrives early and flourishes. In others, it arrives late or seems absent entirely. Climate plays a role. Dense forests may have favoured close-range weapons. Open plains rewarded distance, but culture mattered too. In places with a strong emphasis on ritualised duels or status displays, the bow may have disrupted traditional conflict norms. It was in some ways too efficient, too impersonal. Then there's the sling. Far less famous than the bow, the sling is one of the most underestimated weapons in human history. Made from simple fibres and a pocket of leather or cloth, it could hurl stones at astonishing speeds, up to 120 km per hour in skilled hands, and it left almost no archaeological trace. Sling stones, after all, are just stones, indistinguishable from the environment unless deliberately shaped, which was not always the case. But ethnographic studies and historical records from later periods show the sling to be a devastating tool, especially when used in groups. A barrage of sling stones could scatter animals, repel intruders, or signal ownership of a territory without direct contact. And again, it worked from a distance. In this period, roughly between 20,000 and 8,000 years ago, we are not yet seeing armies, but we are beginning to see the seeds of something new, the ability to apply force without closing the gap, the cognitive separation of action from consequence, and perhaps, just perhaps, the earliest emergence of what we might now call premeditated lethality. This does not mean every archer was a murderer, nor that every sling was used against neighbours. Most were still used to feed families, defend camps from predators, or signal in hunting parties. But once the technology existed, the potential did too, and that potential changes how humans relate to threat. Because with a bow, you don't have to wait, you don't have to talk, you don't have to give a warning, you just draw and release. Some archaeologists have argued that the appearance of bows correlates with increasing social complexity. Others suggest the opposite, that in times of scarcity or fragmentation, distance weapons become tools of survival, not status. The evidence does not resolve this, but it does suggest a period of transition. In burials from the Mesolithic era, in places like Ovnet Cave in Germany or the Iberian sites of Portugal and Spain, we find individuals with signs of high-velocity trauma, not many, and not always clearly linked to arrows, but clustered enough in time and space to raise questions. Were these hunting accidents, personal disputes, or the first faint echoes of coordinated violence? We do not know, and we must resist the temptation to dramatize. There is a long tradition in popular science of projecting modern warfare backwards, imagining prehistoric battles with rows of archers and grand ambushes in the forest. But the evidence is too thin for that. What we see instead is a technological capacity and a behavioral ambiguity, and that is perhaps the most human thing of all. Because the same tool that feeds your child can also kill your rival. The same arrow that brings down a gazelle might one day silence a voice that challenged you. Tools are neutral, but their consequences are not. By the end of this period, around 8,000 years ago, projectile weapons had become widespread across Eurasia, Africa, and parts of the Americas. Their designs varied: composite bows, simple self-bows, slings with leather pouches, darts with weighted shafts. But the principle was always the same: transfer energy across space, change the shape of violence, remove the need to touch, and once that principle was common knowledge, something else changed, something harder to see in the bones. People began to anticipate violence from farther away, camps were placed with line of sight in mind, trails were avoided, watchers were posted. The world became more dangerous, not necessarily because people had changed, but because the margin for trust had shrunk. You no longer had to be attacked to be killed, you just had to be within range. This is not yet war. But it is no longer peace either. It is the liminal zone, the edge of the threshold, the time when hunting bled into something else, when the line between predator and enemy began to blur. And so we return to the question, what happens when you can kill someone without seeing their face? You gain power, but you lose accountability. You change the rules of survival, but you also sever the thread of reciprocity that makes peace possible. And in that silent moment, between drawing the bow and hearing the impact, a new kind of human emerges, one who can act without being seen, one who can strike without being touched, and one who can imagine violence as something that might not come back to them, until, of course, it does. Can a cave painting prove there was a war? That someone somewhere took pigment in hand and tried to remember a conflict, not with words, but with shapes, bodies, and arcs of flight? When we think of prehistoric art, we usually imagine animals: bison in mid-charge, deer suspended in leap, horses, mammoths, wild cattle, but not humans, and certainly not humans harming each other. Yet somewhere between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago, that changed. In the dry rock shelters of Iberia, the sun-blasted plateaus of the Sahara, and the weathered cliffs of the Levant, something new appeared. Rows of small figures, armed with bows, groups in motion, arrows drawn, bodies falling, scenes that feel too organized to be a hunt, and too human to be ignored. The Iberian Levant gives us some of the earliest and most debated of these images. In rock shelters like Les Dogues and Morella la Vella, painted in red ochre and sometimes in black, you find scenes where groups of small stick-like humans, often drawn with feathered headdresses or splayed limbs, face off in what appears to be confrontation. Some carry bows, others seem to be in motion, angled as if running or charging, and crucially some figures lie horizontal with arrows protruding from their bodies. These are not animals, these are people. The paintings are minimalist. No facial expressions, no grand architecture, just clusters of figures, lines, movement. But that movement is unmistakably coordinated. The figures are grouped, the bows are drawn in the same direction, and when a body falls, it falls beneath a cloud of arrows. Now, could this be a ritual dance? Could it be symbolic, not literal, a depiction of myth or ceremony, rather than actual conflict? Yes, that possibility must be taken seriously, because pigment on rock is not a photograph, it's a story. And stories can be many things: warnings, memories, prayers, even lies. But the repetition of certain elements across sites, the posture of aggression, the archer clusters, the fallen bodies, suggests a pattern. And in archaeology, pattern is data. Not proof, not certainty, but data. What these Iberian scenes show us is a new kind of self-awareness, a willingness to depict human conflict as worth recording. These were not scribbles. They took time. They required pigment collection, surface preparation, and deliberate placement. In some cases, older animal paintings were painted over, replaced by humans, and that alone is meaningful. It suggests a shift in what mattered. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean and deep into North Africa, something equally eerie appears. In the rock art of the Central Sahara, particularly the Tassili Naja Plateau in modern-day Algeria, a series of paintings and engravings emerges from around 9,000 to 7,000 years ago. They show human figures, often in rows, carrying bows and sometimes shields. The style is different from Iberia, more abstract in some cases, more detailed in others, but the theme recurs: motion, weaponry, and death. In one of the most cited examples, you find a large composition featuring at least 30 human figures, 10 of whom are clearly drawing bows. Opposing them, another group retreats or falls. Some are pierced with lines that almost certainly represent arrows. There is no text, no voice. But the message is clear. This was not a peaceful gathering, and it wasn't an isolated one. Across the Sahara, in sites like Safar and Jabaran, dozens of panels show similar groupings: archers, lines of advance, bodies bent or fallen. These are not isolated murders. They are not duels. They are something else: coordinated, directional, and remembered. Now, to be clear, not all rock art is about violence. In fact, most isn't. Even in the same regions, you'll find depictions of animals, rituals, pastoral scenes, and daily life. But when violence does appear, it appears with a disturbing consistency, not just in form, but in intention. These are not chaotic scuffles. They're formations, confrontations, possibly ambushes, and above all, they are human on human. The Levant adds yet another layer. In the Negev and Sinai deserts, rock engravings dated to between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago show similar themes: stylized humans, bows drawn, enemies retreating. The precision of the line work varies. Some figures are crude, others more elaborate, but the concept holds. These were not predators and prey, these were peers. So what does it mean to paint violence? One answer is memory, that these were events too meaningful to forget. Perhaps they marked the death of a leader, the defense of a watering hole, the loss of kin, a victory, a tragedy, or simply a warning to those who came later. This is a place where blood has soaked the dust. Another answer is identity. To paint conflict is to declare a line between groups, between us and them, between the self and the other. In that sense, these scenes might not depict battles that happened, but battles that could happen, or that should happen in the minds of those who painted them. Ideology, not history. But a third answer is more subtle: cognition. The very act of painting organised violence suggests a conceptual shift. It means that people no longer saw conflict as a disruption of life, but as part of life, something structured, anticipated, worth representing. And once you can depict war, you can plan it. This may have been the earliest propaganda. A row of archers on a cliff wall is more than a memory. It's a message. It says, "We know how to fight. It says, we remember who we lost. It says, we're not prey. And for those approaching such a site, especially from a different group, that message would have landed. Not in words, but in posture, in numbers, in blood-red pigment that did not wash away with rain. There's another layer too. In several of these sites, especially in Iberia, you find depictions of what appear to be executions, isolated figures on their knees, others standing above with drawn bows or raised weapons. This is not combat. It's theatre, deliberate public punishment, and it implies a social structure in which such acts were carried out and commemorated. This is not the chaos of a fight. It is control, judgment, rule. And once violence becomes formalized, even symbolically, the line between justice and power begins to blur. So, can a cave painting prove there was a war? No, not on its own, but it can show that people thought in ways that made war possible, that they imagined it, remembered it, or warned of it, that they saw groups, enemies, weapons, and consequences, that they connected conflict with identity. And once that connection is made, once violence becomes representable, it is also repeatable. That is the haunting thing about symbols. They don't die when we do. They stay, etched in stone, whispering old loyalties, rekindling old fears. They become templates. And so we look back at these ancient walls, at the stick figures with bows, at the red silhouettes pierced with lines, and we ask not just what happened, but what was learned, what new stories began to circulate, what fears were passed down, what triumphs were glorified, because painting a deer is about survival. Painting a human, that's about meaning, and meaning is where violence becomes something more, something remembered, something taught, something called by name. So we return to the shelter, to the dry cave wall, to the ochre-stained hand that traced out a row of archers, and we ask, who did they fear? Who did they hate? And more importantly, who were they trying to become? Was the first wall built for water or for war? That's the question that lingers in the dust outside ancient Jericho. A question buried in stone, in silence, in a Neolithic mystery that shouldn't even exist. Because if you draw a straight line through early human history, through mobility and camps and seasonal routes, through foraging and fire and slow rituals around hearths, you don't expect to find a wall, especially not this early, especially not one this tall, and yet here it is, nearly 10,000 years old. Not a myth, not a symbol. Real limestone blocks, cut and stacked, over 3 meters high, surrounding what was once a tightly packed cluster of houses at the base of a small spring. Jericho, or as archaeologists often call it, Tel es Sultan, was not the first place humans lived, but it may be the first place they stayed long enough to need defence. Or was it protection of another kind? Let's go back. Not to the Iron Age city, or the biblical Jericho of collapsing walls, but much further. Back to the pre-pottery Neolithic period, around 8,500 years before the Common Era. This was a time when agriculture was just beginning to shape human lives, when wild grasses were being coaxed into early wheat, when goats and sheep were lingering longer near settlements, and when human groups for the first time were becoming visibly stationary. Jericho was not alone, but it was exceptional. Built at the edge of an oasis in the Jordan Valley, it was fed by a perennial spring, Ain es-Sultan, that provided fresh water in a landscape otherwise harsh and dry. That water made Jericho possible. It also made it desirable, and that's where the wall comes in. When the site was excavated in the 20th century by Kathleen Kenyon and others, what emerged was startling. A circular wall surrounding the settlement, a ditch cut into the bedrock, and, most surprising of all, a massive stone tower, nearly 9 meters tall, tucked into the inner side of the wall. This wasn't a makeshift barricade. It was monumental, coordinated, planned. The labour alone, dragging and stacking stone without metal tools or wheeled carts, would have required hundreds of people. Which raises a deeper question. Why? One of the earliest interpretations was simple and dramatic. The wall was built for defence, against enemies, against raids, against the ancient fear that someone, somewhere, might come for what was yours. But that theory didn't sit comfortably with the rest of the evidence, because if this was a fortress, it was a strange one. There were no clear signs of battlements, no arrow slits, no defensive towers at intervals, and the wall itself, while imposing, didn't enclose the entire site, at least not in the earliest phase. So if it wasn't designed for active defence, what was it for? Another theory, now widely discussed, is that the wall was built to hold back not people, but water. Seasonal floods in the valley could have threatened the settlement, and a circular retaining wall might have helped divert runoff and protect the spring. In that reading, the ditch wasn't a moat, it was drainage. The tower wasn't a lookout, it was a foundation, maybe even a ritual structure. And that's the central tension in the Jericho debate. Protection from what? If it was water, then the wall represents a triumph of early engineering, a collective response to environmental stress, a way for a community to adapt to seasonal rhythms and protect their home. But if it was war, even the early rumblings of it, then it represents something else entirely, the beginning of fear made permanent, the physical manifestation of anxiety, conflict or memory. The first wall is not just a boundary but a scar. There's another detail. The houses at Jericho were round, mud brick structures clustered tightly together, and underneath many of them, buried carefully, archaeologists have found human skulls, often just the cranium, sometimes plastered and painted, with shells placed in the eye sockets. These were not casual burials, they were ritual, ancestral, deliberate, a way to remember the dead, or to anchor them in place. Some scholars believe these skulls were meant to tie families to their homes, to establish lineage, ownership, permanence, and that too is part of the wall story. Because once homes become heritage, they must be defended. Urban density changes the game. When people begin living elbow to elbow, when waste accumulates, when food stores are gathered in bulk and left in baskets or pits, when the spring becomes a public resource rather than a passing one, all of that creates new pressures. Conflict may not have caused the wall, but it may have followed it, because once you have a wall, you have something to breach. Some archaeologists suggest the tower had symbolic value, a marker of communal identity, a signpost of us. Its shadow would have stretched across the settlement in the morning sun. It may have gathered people around it, defined space, even told time. But it also told others, there is something here. We do not know if the people of Jericho faced direct attacks. There are no massacre layers, no burned buildings from this period, no piles of weapons. But the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And perhaps, like today, the wall served multiple functions. It kept water out, it kept children in, it defined space, it gave shape to fear, and over time, it may have helped shape the very idea of what a settlement should be. Because after Jericho, walls begin to spread, not immediately and not everywhere, but the concept of fortification, of building barriers, slowly appears across the Fertile Crescent and beyond. At first, perhaps, as flood control, but later, unmistakably, as defence. So was Jericho the first wall? Probably not. Temporary barricades must have existed earlier, fences, brush piles, ditches, but Jericho's wall is the first stone structure on this scale that survives. The first time we see the earth rearranged not to follow a river or climb a hill, but to keep something out. And once that idea takes root, that space can be claimed, enclosed, defined. Everything else follows: territory, inheritance, property, and eventually sovereignty. What makes Jericho so haunting is that it sits at the edge of two worlds. It is still Neolithic, still early, still closer to the wild than to the state. But it has already begun to imagine danger in shapes and borders, to prepare for threats not yet visible, to remember something or someone worth guarding, and maybe that's why it matters. Because the first wall is not about stone, it's about intention. It's about the moment when people decided that living together meant someone might come for them. That cooperation came with exposure, that permanence had a cost. It is tempting to read the wall as a prelude to war, a silent drumbeat before the first clash. But it may also be a kind of prayer, a plea for safety, a shelter from the unknown, a message to the sky or the gods or the ancestors buried beneath the floorboards. We have built something, please let it last. Today the ruins of Jericho's wall are barely a mound. Weathered blocks, eroded faces, sun-bleached limestone, but they still speak, not loudly, not clearly, but insistently. They ask us to look not at what they protected, but why they were needed at all. Because once the first wall goes up, the world changes, not just physically, but psychologically. and behind every wall since, from medieval ramparts to razor wire, you can still hear the echo of that first one, the one that shouldn't exist, but does, and so we stand in its shadow and wonder, was it water, or was it war, or maybe both, because the human story is rarely simple, and sometimes a wall is built not because someone is coming, but because we remember when they did. There is a strange quiet in the archaeological record between the rise of domesticated animals and the first full wars, but it's not a peaceful quiet. It is the quiet of low voices, of footsteps at night, of a fence that wasn't there the season before. Something new had entered the human world, something alive, mobile and worth stealing. And that thing had 4 legs. Between 9,000 and 6,000 years before the Common Era, across the Near East, Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains, the domestication of animals changed everything. People had kept dogs for much longer, but this was different. This was sheep, goats, later cattle. This was meat, milk, mobility, and manure. A walking, growing form of wealth that could be counted, guarded, lost, or stolen. And unlike a basket of grain, it could flee. Herding began as a flexible practice, sometimes seasonal, sometimes fully mobile, often blurred with small-scale farming. But its social consequences were immediate. Surplus, once a question of granaries and harvests, became something you could walk with, or ride. Pastoralists could now expand across marginal landscapes. They moved with the seasons, they needed more land, more water, more pasture, and they began to encounter other people who wanted the same. It is here that we find the earlier shadows of organised raiding, not war in the cinematic sense. But neither was it the kind of isolated violence we saw in earlier periods. This was targeted, motivated, tactical. It was a new category of aggression, aimed not at extermination, but at acquisition. To raid was to survive smarter. And the most successful raids didn't kill anyone. They just made someone else walk home with nothing. Some of the clearest evidence comes not from weapons or mass graves, but from settlement patterns and animal remains. Sites like Ali Kosh in the Dailuran plain of southwestern Iran show a shift toward more guarded settlement positioning, with early signs of palisades and stock control. We see an increasing ratio of domesticated to wild species, and signs that herds were being kept in corrals or driven into protected zones. This wasn't just about raising animals, it was about defending them, and when something is worth defending, it quickly becomes worth taking. Across these regions, evidence of traumatic injuries begins to show a different pattern, not just interpersonal disputes, but signs of ambush, blunt trauma from behind, projectile injuries aimed low, toward the hamstrings or legs, disabling rather than killing. It suggests a logic of disruption, not slaughter. If a rival group couldn't move their herd, they couldn't survive the season. It's tempting to see these events as economic, but they were also deeply personal. In many traditional herding societies studied in more recent ethnographies, livestock are not just wealth, they are identity, bride wealth, status, memory, revenge. To steal an animal was to insult a lineage. To refuse return was to challenge a family's honour. And so, the raid did not end when the goats were gone. It lingered. It simmered. It waited for the next opportunity. What begins here, in this hazy zone between early pastoralism and formalised combat, is a cycle that will repeat across history. Livestock raiding followed by counter-raid, a small loss escalating into a blood feud. One act of theft remembered not for what it took, but for how it was taken. Anthropologists have studied these revenge loops in cultures from the Dinka of South Sudan, to the Nuer of Ethiopia, the Uruk of Anatolia, to the Maasai of East Africa. The patterns echo backward, and while we must be careful not to project too far into prehistory, the structure of the raid cycle, attack, insult, retaliation, memory, is ancient. It did not require writing, just time and pain. This proto-conflict economy also shaped the landscape. Pastoralists needed predictable routes, seasonal grazing grounds and water access. But now they also needed defensibility. We begin to see early choices in camp placement, higher ground, narrow passes, river bends. These were not fortresses, but they were intentional. They were decisions made with other humans in mind. And here we arrive at something subtle. The invention of planning not just for food or shelter, but for threat. To think of a landscape as dangerous before it becomes so. to imagine violence not just as an accident but as a possibility. That shift in mindset may have mattered more than any arrow. As the Holocene stabilised and the world became warmer and wetter, populations grew. Groups that had once drifted past each other seasonally now began to bump into each other regularly. Boundaries, previously soft and seasonal, became contested. This was especially true in ecotonal zones where farming and herding overlapped. Agriculturalists had fixed fields. Pastoralists had moving herds. The potential for conflict was structural, but it wasn't yet civilization. There were no states, no professional soldiers, just small groups watching the horizon, trying to hold on to what they had, and what they had for the first time in history could move. What's also remarkable is that many of these early herding societies likely had internal mechanisms for managing tension: assemblies, elders, negotiation rituals. Revenge was not always inevitable, but the tools to stop it, language, culture, social norms, had to evolve alongside the weapons, and sometimes they didn't evolve fast enough. There is a hypothesis among some anthropologists that this period may have laid the psychological groundwork for institutional violence. The idea that threat can come from outside your kin group, that resources are zero-sum, that defence requires preemption. None of this was necessarily conscious, but once it enters a culture's logic, even as myth or story, it becomes durable and hard to unlearn. So what do we make of this chapter in the human story? It is not yet war, but it is not peace. It is a world where people could wake to find their animals gone, where a wound was remembered for generations, where revenge could travel on foot. We often imagine violence as a sudden event, a moment of chaos, but here we see its quieter form, strategic, calculated, measured in milk lost, not blood spilled, and the haunting question is this: once we began to think of other humans as a threat to our surplus, was war just an inevitability of scale? Or did we have a moment, brief, forgotten, where we could have chosen another path? You could walk into a city and never touch the ground, at least not if that city was Çatalhöyük. What appears today as a great mound in the Konya plain of central Anatolia once housed thousands of people stacked tightly together in a honeycomb of mud brick structures with no streets, no alleys, and no doorways facing out. If you wanted to visit your neighbours, you didn't knock. You climbed a ladder onto your roof, crossed over theirs, and dropped in through the ceiling like a polite burglar. It is one of the earliest known urban settlements in human history. But what makes it so haunting is not just its age. It is how it was built, densely, defensively, as if it expected trouble. The first bricks of Çatalhöyük were laid sometime around 7,500 years before the Common Era, in the midst of a radically changing world. Farming was spreading, so was population. People were settling down in larger and more permanent communities, and with that came the need for something that had never existed at scale before: security. Not just from wild animals or seasonal floods, but from other people. For most of its existence, Çatalhöyük had no perimeter wall, no standing army, no metal weapons, and no known rulers. And yet it persisted for more than 1,000 years. So how did it stay safe? The secret, it seems, was in the rooftops. Houses were built wall-to-wall in tightly packed blocks, forming a near-continuous surface of rooftops across the settlement. Entry was from above, through small holes in the ceiling that could be closed from within. That meant no exposed doors, no ground-level access, and no obvious entry points for anyone who wasn't invited. If you wanted to raid Çatalhöyük, you had to climb it, and that gave the residents the high ground, literally. The entire city was a defensible structure, not because it was surrounded by walls, but because it was made of them. Inside, life was anything but peaceful. Excavations of more than 800 burials beneath house floors have revealed skulls with blunt force trauma, healed fractures, and occasional signs of violent death. This was not constant warfare, but it was not utopia either. People lived closely, tensions built, disputes over land, water, and status must have flared, and yet somehow the system held. There are no known mass graves, no palatial compounds, and no elite warrior class. This was a city of equals, or at least something closer to it than anything that would follow. The layout of the settlement may have been its greatest strength. By removing public streets, Çatalhöyük eliminated many of the vulnerabilities of typical urban planning. Attackers could not sweep through alleys, fire could not spread as easily. Every roof was both a home and a watchpost. In an age before centralised fortresses, this was defensive architecture by diffusion. The people of Çatalhöyük were not walled off from danger. They lived in anticipation of it, together, above the ground, always watching. But if there was danger, where did it come from? That part remains unclear. There is no direct evidence of a large-scale external conflict during the city's early centuries. No signs of enemy sieges, no layers of ash from destruction. Some researchers argue that the settlement was more concerned with internal cohesion than external threats. Others see the architecture as a quiet answer to a growing problem, the increasing tension between sedentary communities and the mobile groups around them. Pastoralists and foragers likely moved through the plains nearby. Some may have traded, others may have taken what they needed. And for those with surplus grain, livestock or tools, the threat of theft, or worse, was real. In such a context, a city like Çatalhöyük was not just a place to live. It was a statement. This land is ours. This grain is guarded. These rooftops are not for strangers. Inside the homes, the walls were often painted with murals. Some depicted leopards or vultures. Others showed headless figures or bulls with exaggerated horns. Whether these were religious, symbolic or commemorative is still debated. But the imagery hints at a world where power, fear and reverence for death were part of the everyday atmosphere. Burials beneath the floors included skulls that had been removed and reburied multiple times, suggesting ancestor veneration, or perhaps trophies of some kind. Here again, the line between memory and menace blurs. One of the most curious features of Çatalhöyük is how its architecture reflects both trust and fear. You lived inches away from your neighbours, shared walls with extended kin, and relied on each other for access and protection. But you also sealed your roof at night. You made sure your entry hole could be barred. The city was a community and a fortress, and it lasted for centuries. By 6,300 years before the Common Era, Çatalhöyük had begun to decline. Newer settlements emerged with more hierarchical structures, larger public spaces, and eventually true defensive walls. The rooftop fortress model faded. It had worked, for a while, but the world was changing again. Populations were growing, resources were being concentrated. The slow simmer of interpersonal tension was turning into something bigger, something closer to what we would later call war. What Çatalhöyük shows us is that conflict does not always announce itself with blood and fire. Sometimes it whispers in architecture, in the way homes are stacked, in how people enter or block each other out. It lives in the tension between community and control, between trust and protection. And sometimes, the first walls are not walls at all. They are choices, repeated over generations to build higher, closer, tighter, until the very shape of your city becomes a shield. So here's the question. If the people of Çatalhöyük never built a wall, why did they live like they already needed one? There are landscapes in prehistory that look like wounds, dried out lake beds, forests turned to sand, rivers that never made it back. And when we zoom out across time, it's tempting to imagine that human conflict always started with a spear, or a border, or a grudge. But what if it started with the weather? What if the first long wars began when the sky turned silent and the grass didn't return? What if violence was simply the aftershock of a hungry earth? Roughly 12,000 years ago the climate calmed. After the chaos of the Pleistocene, with its wild ice sheets, violent swings and deadly pulses, the Earth finally exhaled into what we now call the Holocene. It was a quieter phase, a warmer one, more stable than anything the genus Homo had known before. But stability, it turned out, was only a relative term, because even within the Holocene, nature still had moods, and it is in these subtler climatic moods, droughts, floods, cold snaps and abrupt shifts, that archaeologists now trace the fingerprints of some of the first resource-based conflicts. Start with the so-called 8.2 kiloyear event, a global cooling episode that struck around 8,200 years ago. Ice core data from Greenland shows a sudden drop in temperatures, likely triggered by the catastrophic drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz in North America. When this fresh water flooded into the North Atlantic, it disrupted ocean currents and temporarily derailed the planet's heat engine. Across the Middle East and parts of Africa, rainfall collapsed. Archaeological sites in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant record signs of village abandonment, crop failures, and abrupt demographic shifts. But what's most telling isn't just that people moved, it's where they moved to. In nearly every case, the regions that retained water became unusually crowded, and with crowding comes pressure. In the Zagros Mountains of modern-day Iran, settlement patterns show smaller, denser communities beginning to appear in the wake of this climate shock. These aren't just casual camps, they are defensive by design, elevated positions, bottleneck entrances, rapid fortification of hilltop sites. Not full walls, not yet, but the nervous architecture of people who no longer felt entirely safe. It's one of the first archaeological hints that scarcity had begun to sculpt conflict. But it wasn't just cold that sparked violence. Dryness may have been even deadlier. The Sahara was once green. Between about 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, the African humid period turned what is now endless desert into a fertile web of lakes, rivers, and grasslands. For thousands of years, people lived across this landscape, fishing, herding, farming, moving seasonally between basins. But around 6,000 years ago, the monsoon shifted. Rainfall pulled southward, and the Sahara began to die. What followed wasn't a single exodus, but a slow collapse. Populations retreated to shrinking ecological islands, oases, riverbanks, highlands. In the rock shelters of the central Sahara, paintings from this era become darker. Earlier scenes show humans dancing with animals, swimming, herding. But later we begin to see weapons, lines of archers, groups facing off, individuals lying prone, pierced by arrows. It's hard to call these depictions literal battles, but the symbolic vocabulary of threat had undeniably entered the art. And that suggests something new in the human experience. The emotional memory of fear between groups. The story repeats elsewhere. In the early Neolithic settlements of the Iranian plateau, the arrival of arid phases correlates with shifts in burial practices. Some sites begin to separate the dead, with certain individuals placed in crouched, isolated graves, sometimes with trauma, sometimes with none. But the pattern hints at social differentiation, maybe even ostracism, as the fabric of shared abundance unravelled. Even without mass graves or known battles, the rhythm of climate-induced stress begins to leave its imprint on human relations. In the Indus region of South Asia, paleoenvironmental studies suggest that the gradual decline of the Sarasvati river system, once a major artery of settlement, may have pushed Neolithic communities into competition over water access. Seasonal migration routes collapsed, agriculture shrank back to monsoon-fed zones, and as elsewhere, the result wasn't necessarily open war but friction. Uneven resources, broken pacts, fragile alliances stretched too thin. Even in parts of Europe, Holocene climate events nudged populations toward potential conflict. The late Mesolithic in the Balkans, for instance, shows a sudden uptick in hilltop settlements during periods of cooler, drier climate. These locations weren't ideal for farming or trade, but they offered visibility and defensibility. That suggests a growing concern not with the land, but with the people nearby. And perhaps most hauntingly, in northern China, a series of Holocene droughts punctuated the Neolithic period. Studies of ancient lake levels and less sequences show repeated dry spells that drove early agricultural communities to abandon their fields and resettle elsewhere. But each wave of migration pushed into zones already occupied, and while we have little direct evidence of war, what we do find is telling. Overlapping habitation layers with burn marks, collapsed dwellings, and sudden shifts in pottery style. Not the slow evolution of culture, but its violent replacement. To be clear, none of this proves war. Climate alone does not make people violent. But the archaeological record tells a quiet, disturbing truth, that whenever the earth withheld its generosity, humans were forced to make harder decisions, and those decisions were rarely fair. The powerful took more, the vulnerable were pushed to the margins, and slowly, over thousands of years, the logic of survival began to resemble the logic of conquest. What is war, if not organised desperation? By the end of this period, something had shifted. Humans were no longer just reacting to each other. They were reacting to scarcity itself, to floods that wiped out granaries, to droughts that silenced rivers, to cold years that emptied the hills of game. And in that constant negotiation with a moody planet, humans began to carry not just tools and food, but fear. Fear that the next dry season would come early. Fear that a neighbour would not share. Fear that the only safe place was one you could defend. There are no generals in this story. No manifestos, no flags, just weather, slowly breaking the equilibrium of early society. So if we want to understand where war came from, maybe we need to stop looking only at bones and arrows. Maybe we need to look up, at the clouds that failed, at the wind that changed direction, at the rain that never came. Because sometimes the first enemy wasn't another tribe, it was the sky. And the question that lingers is this: if our oldest conflicts began with climate, what happens when the climate turns hostile again? It began with a pit, just a quiet hole in the earth, opened by accident in the year 1983 during routine construction work in the small German village of Talheim. A cellar for a new house, they thought. Instead, they uncovered something far older and far more intimate. A narrow ditch, about 7 meters long. Inside, the skeletons of 34 people lay jumbled and broken, twisted not by time but by something more deliberate, something that had left its mark on the bone. Many of the skulls were cracked with sharp, decisive blows. Some showed clean, circular punctures, the unmistakable calling card of a stone axe driven straight into the head. Others had arms raised in defensive posture, a gesture fossilized in calcium and grief. But this was not a battlefield. There were no weapons left behind, no sign of opposing sides, just a single group dumped in a trench, left to disappear into the soil of Central Europe. Dated to around 7,000 years ago, or 5,000 years before the beginning of the Common Era. The Talheim death pit became one of the oldest pieces of direct evidence for organised human killing on a scale that seemed neither random nor personal, a mass grave, a massacre. And for perhaps the first time in the prehistoric record, a set of clues detailed enough to reconstruct the why, not just the how. The people of Talheim belonged to the linear pottery culture, a Neolithic farming society that had spread across much of Europe from the east, bringing with them agriculture, ceramic design, and a lifestyle no longer tied to migration. They lived in rectangular timber houses, cultivated grain, and raised domesticated animals. They buried their dead, made ornaments, and traced long-distance exchange networks. But the people in this grave weren't buried in the ceremonial style of their culture. They weren't laid to rest with care or tribute. They were discarded. Among the dead were men, women, and children, all ages, but not all types. Isotope analysis, the science of reading ancient chemical signatures from teeth and bones, revealed something unexpected. The males in the grave mostly showed local signatures. Their childhood diets, their water sources, their environmental backgrounds all pointed to the Talheim region. These were people who had grown up nearby, locals, but many of the adult females showed different chemical traces. Their isotopic signatures came from elsewhere, suggesting they had been born or raised in other regions before arriving in Talheim. This pattern was striking. It implied that the Talheim community had included women who had come from outside, perhaps through marriage exchanges, migration, or alliance building. These women had integrated into the group and died alongside it. But crucially, not all women were found in the grave. Several expected demographic groups were missing: adolescent girls, infant boys, a few childbearing age females. They weren't there, and their absence may be as loud as the violence itself. One theory emerged from this absence, that this was not just a killing, it was a targeted removal, a raid. The attackers may have taken young women and children, abducting them as captives or as future members of their own group while executing the rest. If so, Talheim may not just be the first massacre, it may also be the first crime scene. But who were the attackers, and why? There's no direct evidence at the site for who carried out the violence. No clear external village, no names, no confessions. But the layout of linear pottery settlements, their proximity to each other, and other nearby death pits of similar style, suggest that the violence may have been intercommunity. Neighbour against neighbour. Other sites in Germany and Austria, like Schletz and Aspern, show comparable mass graves from the same era, also with signs of head trauma and systematic killing. In one, a palisade had been breached. In another, starving bodies had fallen amid signs of siege. These were not one-off acts. They were part of a pattern. Why this pattern emerged when it did is a deeper question. The Neolithic world brought many gifts: food surplus, permanent homes, increased population. But with those gifts came something darker: competition. Land could now be owned, crops stored, and herds raised. Villages became invested in territory, Inheritance created bloodlines, surplus created risk, and with more people packed into closer quarters, the margin for tolerance shrank. Conflict over resources may have been the most basic fuel, but it's also possible that deeper structures were forming: group identity, memory of grievances, cycles of revenge. Raids may have escalated into retaliations. A stolen herd became a murdered cousin. A murdered cousin became a war. The Talheim pit tells us what happened, but not how it felt. We cannot hear the screams or see the fires or watch the panicked run from home to ambush. We can only read the final result: 34 lives crushed, abandoned and forgotten, until a backhoe stumbled into memory 7,000 years later. The site also forces us to ask a more uncomfortable question. Was this massacre unusual, or just unusually preserved? Is Talheim the first, or simply the first we've found? Stone axes do not fossilise intention, but they do leave holes in skulls, and holes tell stories. We are left, again, with ambiguity, with science that speaks softly, offering patterns but not conclusions. Was this a territorial war? A resource grab? A revenge killing? All of the above? What we know is that Talheim marks a point in deep time where interpersonal violence transformed into something else, something planned, large-scale and impersonal, not just murder, not just defence, something coordinated, something rehearsed. So perhaps the question is not just why this happened, but what made it possible, what changed in the human brain, or the village structure, or the pressure cooker of early society that made it thinkable to kill not just someone, but everyone. And when the pit was dug, was it pre-dug, ready for bodies, or dug afterward to erase what could not be explained? Because here, beneath a quiet German garden, lies the evidence not just of death, but of memory being interrupted, and it makes you wonder, how many Talheims are still buried under our feet? Why did we start building walls before we built governments? It is a question that feels backwards. In the modern world, walls are things we expect from states, kings and empires, after armies are trained and enemies are declared. But what if it happened the other way around? What if the wall came first, before writing, before borders, before the word war was ever whispered? What if the wall wasn't a symbol of power, but of fear, somewhere between 6,000 and 4,000 years before the Common Era, in the dust and density of small farming villages across Central Europe and the Near East, humans began doing something strange. They began building their homes tighter. They began surrounding their settlements with ditches, palisades and ramparts. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in clusters, in patterns, in places that suggest something had changed. Something had made a small village feel vulnerable enough to dig a trench around its perimeter. Something had made neighbours seem like a risk. And what's more haunting, the same archaeological sites that give us some of the earliest evidence for village-scale defences are also the same places where entire communities were destroyed. Let's begin with Schletz. This quiet Austrian site was once a village belonging to the linear pottery culture, or LBK, one of the first farming groups to sweep across Central Europe during the 6th millennium before the Common Era. Schletz was not grand. It was not fortified like a fortress. It was just a little village on a ridge, overlooking a small valley ringed by a ditch. But the ditch wasn't for water, it wasn't for drainage, it was filled with people. Excavations have uncovered the remains of over 200 individuals at Schletz, not buried carefully, not laid to rest. Their bones were broken, scattered, left in collapsed heaps. Many were missing limbs, many were children, and the settlement itself had been burned. This is not an isolated case. Other LBK sites, such as Talheim, Herxheim and Kilienstetten, show similar patterns: violent trauma, crushed skulls, and systematic execution. But what makes Schletz especially haunting is not just the massacre, it's the suggestion that the villagers saw it coming. The ditch wasn't ornamental, it was functional, defensive. It was there to slow something down, and that's the key. Not just that violence had escalated, but that people had begun to expect it. The communities started changing the way they were built in anticipation of threats. This is the origin of the fortified village, not as a declaration of conquest, but as a quiet, desperate adaptation. Let's shift eastward. In the Near East, a site called Tel Es-Sarwan in modern-day Iraq offers another early example of defensive planning. Between 6,000 and 5,000 years before the Common Era, The people of Tell Es-Sawon built a large ditch around their village, 3 meters wide and over 2 meters deep. Inside, they lived in dense clusters of mud brick buildings, with signs of storage, especially grain. It's important to understand what this means. Storage was not just food, storage was wealth. Once humans began to harvest more than they immediately consumed, they had to protect what they kept. A granary became a target. A clay jar filled with barley became something worth killing over, and so the ditch was dug. There is no direct evidence of a massacre at Tell Es-Sawon, no bodies in the moat. But the architecture speaks. Defensive ditches, narrow access points, walled storage rooms. These are not coincidences, these are reactions, subtle signs that violence had become a recurring enough possibility that it shaped how people lived. Further west, in Anatolia, a site known as Hakhla also began to evolve toward defensiveness during this same window of time. The settlement's layout grew tighter, houses shared walls, access routes were controlled. While earlier Neolithic sites had often been more open and expansive, this shift in Hakla's design points to a rising sense of threat. You do not thicken your walls unless you think something might try to break them. So what changed? Why, after thousands of years of small-scale farming, did people suddenly start building moats and stacking mud brick like shields? The answer may lie in numbers. Population was increasing, villages were getting larger, the density of settlements meant that neighbours were no longer distant, and in times of scarcity, especially in a climate as volatile as the mid-Holocene, those neighbours might come for your crops, your herds, or your children. In small-scale societies, raids were often targeted. One group might attack another to seize resources or to retaliate for a past offence. But when populations grow and when groups are no longer mobile, the stakes rise. You cannot run if you are tied to land. You cannot hide if you have granaries to defend. The village becomes a sitting target, and the solution? Build a wall, dig a ditch, make your entrances narrow, create choke points, sleep lighter. But let's be honest, not every ditch means war. Archaeologists must tread carefully here. Some features we interpret as defensive may have had other purposes, for drainage, for ritual, or for animal control. Context is everything. A ditch alone does not confirm a battle. But when you find trauma alongside it, when you see smashed bones, burned homes, and hasty burials, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. What's equally intriguing is what this tells us about the psychological evolution of fear. Defense is not just a reaction to violence, it is a rehearsal for it. To build a wall is to believe in the possibility of an enemy. To reshape your home in anticipation of an attack is to internalize conflict, to make it part of your architecture. And that, in itself, is a major turning point, because walls outlast memories. Once you build them, they remain. Future generations may forget the original threat, but they inherit the structure, and with it, a narrative, that someone, somewhere, might come for you. So perhaps the rise of the fortified village was not just a technological shift, but a mythological one, a shift in worldview, the beginning of us versus them baked into the very bricks of our homes. No kings had yet risen, no formal states, no armies, but already humans were shaping the land to repel each other. Already they were digging lines between inside and outside. Already the quiet tension that would one day build empires was settling into the soil of the first farmsteads, and perhaps the most haunting thing is this. Many of those walls failed. Schletz, Talheim, Herxheim. These were not success stories. These were attempts. Desperate early attempts to survive a new kind of danger. They didn't work, but the idea stayed. We built walls before we built cities. We imagined enemies before we imagined nations. And once you start building walls, what else starts to build with them? What happens when a war doesn't leave bones in the ground but vanishes half of the genome? Between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, something silent swept across the world. It wasn't a weapon, or a city, or a new idea. It was the slow erasure of male bloodlines, a genetic event so vast it would take until the 21st century to even detect it. Not through archaeology, but through the invisible code of living men. It's been called the Y chromosome bottleneck, and it might be the clearest evolutionary signal we have for violence without a battlefield. To understand it, we have to shrink our scale, not to settlements or skeletons, but to the chromosomes carried in human cells. Every human inherits 23 pairs, but the Y chromosome is different. It's passed only from father to son, a fragile male heirloom, easily lost and never recovered once broken. And when scientists at Stanford University began sequencing male genomes across the globe in the 2010s, they noticed something strange. Around 8,000 years ago, male genetic diversity dropped catastrophically, but only the male lines. The mitochondrial DNA, which mothers pass to children, showed no such collapse. Something, it seemed, had wiped out most of the patrilineals. The numbers were shocking. In many regions, as few as one man for every 17 women contributed to the next generation's Y chromosomes. This wasn't a local tragedy, it was global, seen in Europe, East Asia, the Americas, and parts of Africa. And it couldn't be explained by disease or random drift. It was too sharp, too widespread, and too sex-specific. Something had reduced most men's reproductive legacy to zero. But there were no mass graves, no trauma patterns, no physical signs of a genocide. So what exactly happened? The leading hypothesis is cultural, or more precisely cultural warfare. By the early Holocene, human societies were beginning to form kin-based clans, groups where power, land and marriage were controlled through the male line. These weren't states or cities, but they had rules, and those rules often centred on patrilineal identity. And when those lineages fought, not just with spears but with social systems, the losers may not have just lost land, they lost legacy. Entire male lines could be extinguished not just through death, but through exclusion. This is the world of cultural hitchhiking. A concept borrowed from genetics, it refers to how traits can spread not because they are adaptive, but because they ride alongside something that is. In this case, the traits being passed down were clan structures, systems of male dominance, power consolidation, and reproductive monopolization. And when one clan defeated another, it wasn't just territory that changed hands. Women could be absorbed into the victor's group, but men, often they were erased, not just in practice, but in DNA. It's likely the real violence didn't look like a single massacre. It looked like generations of subtle warfare. Male-on-male competition that rewarded domination of resources, social alliances, and reproductive access. In small tribal networks, even modest shifts in marriage rules or inheritance patterns could lead to exponential differences in genetic survival. Over time, a few dominant male lines swelled, while others vanished completely. Not because the men weren't born, but because they weren't allowed to become ancestors. This makes the Y chromosome bottleneck one of the most chilling events in human evolution. Not because it's visible, but because it isn't. It's not a battlefield you can excavate. It's a silence in the tree of life, a void where millions of potential lineages could have branched, and didn't. And yet it's also a reminder that war isn't always loud. It can be quiet, slow, structural, passed down in laws and customs rather than arrowheads and wounds. The bottleneck forces us to rethink violence not just as physical destruction, but as the systematic control over who gets to persist. Today, most of the world's Y chromosomes descend from a shockingly small group of ancient men, warlords without names, whose victories echo not in ruins but in blood. Their dominance wasn't written in stone or on walls, it was written in the genes of their sons and the absence of sons in everyone else. So what kind of war leaves no bones, no weapons, no ruins? Just an empty branch in the family tree. And if half of male history was erased, how would we know? If war was born long before cities, then it came into the world without generals, without banners, and without rules. But what if that last part isn't true? What if the earliest violence wasn't random at all? What if it came with its own quiet set of rules, passed mouth to mouth, scar to scar, long before anyone could write them down? In the shadow of written history, we tend to imagine ancient people as brutal or lawless. But the truth is, even our most distant cousins, those who still live by the bow, the spear, and the silence of the forest, rarely killed without reason, or at least without explanation. Because for most of human history, violence had to be personal, it had to be earned, it had to be remembered. We can't dig honour out of the ground, but anthropology has a strange time machine of its own, and it shows us something quiet but profound, that tribal societies, the ones most removed from modern state violence, still had clear expectations about when blood should be spilled and when it shouldn't. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, Before colonial interventions, dozens of distinct cultural groups maintained what anthropologists sometimes call ritualized warfare. Fights could happen, but they followed rules. Who was allowed to fight, what weapons were fair, what days were off limits, and above all, there were paths back to peace, if both sides followed the script. Ambushes might occur, but so too might negotiations, compensation, and the formal exchange of women or pigs to settle the score. The Dani people, for example, engaged in what looked like lethal raiding, but was bounded by social protocols. An enemy might be killed in battle, but mutilation of the corpse was rare. And when tensions cooled, sometimes years later, peace ceremonies were held, bones were counted, debts were named, and often these debts were repaid with goods, not blood. Among the Nuer of South Sudan, a man's death in combat could be resolved through bride wealth payments to the bereaved kin. Vengeance was real, but it was not eternal. A price could be paid. The score could be settled in cattle rather than corpses. Even among foragers like the Kungsan, societies not commonly associated with warfare, violence was not absent, but it was treated as deeply consequential. Homicide cases were rare, but when they occurred, they sparked a slow, careful reckoning. Retribution was not automatic. The killer might be punished by exile, or, in some cases, by a counter-killing. But always, the act required community consensus. What these patterns suggest is something vital. That even before laws, there was justice, and even before armies, there were codes. Why would such rules evolve at all? One answer is the same as for almost everything else in human evolution: survival. A society that spirals into endless cycles of revenge doesn't last. Sooner or later, someone has to put the knife down. Sooner or later, someone has to say, enough. Ethnographer Raymond Kelly, who spent decades studying lethal violence in tribal societies, argued that the presence or absence of warlike conflict often depended on the presence or absence of norms that suppressed group revenge. He noted that among the Semai of Malaysia, cultural norms made any form of killing, even revenge killing, morally abhorrent. As a result, homicide rates were astonishingly low. These were not innocent people. They were people with rules. But the presence of such rules doesn't mean all violence stopped. It simply means it became legible, understandable, predictable. A structured part of life, not its collapse. One of the clearest patterns to emerge from anthropology is that most pre-state societies distinguished carefully between types of killing. There was revenge, personal, targeted, emotionally loaded, and there was war, group-based, strategic, often ritualized. The first could start with a stolen goat. The second might unfold over generations. Sometimes the two were indistinguishable. A revenge raid might evolve into something wider. A boundary dispute might spark repeated skirmishes, escalating beyond repair. And sometimes peace rituals failed. A payment was rejected. A wrong was declared unpayable, and the knives came out again. In this world, everyone remembered everything. Every scar had a name. Every death had a witness. You could walk into a village and carry 5 generations of grudges with you. But that didn't mean violence was inevitable. It meant it was negotiable. Anthropologist Marshall Salins once suggested that hunter-gatherer life wasn't dominated by conflict, but by kinship. The rules that governed violence were the same ones that governed marriage, trade, and ritual. You fought who you could not marry. You married to avoid a fight. You gave to prove peace. You killed to avenge its absence. The idea that early people were governed by arbitrary rage is a myth. If anything, they were governed by memory, and memory, unlike metal, does not rust. There is, however, a darker possibility. That rules of war and rules of honor didn't always limit violence, but enabled it. When violence is sacred, when it's bound to lineage or gods or law, it becomes harder to stop. The person who kills in chaos might be punished, but the person who kills in honor, they might be praised, or worse, expected. In some cases, vengeance wasn't just allowed, it was mandatory. Among the Yanomami, a death could trigger a blood feud that spanned generations. Boys were raised to avenge their uncles. Peace was a wound that hadn't been scratched yet. And here we arrive at the question that haunts every anthropologist. Were these customs preventing violence or preserving it? There may be no easy answer. Perhaps they did both. Perhaps they gave humans a way to contain aggression when it burned, and a reason to keep the coals hot when it dimmed. A society that remembers its enemies is a society that can survive, but also a society that can never quite heal. If there's any lesson to be drawn from these early rules of killing, it's that humans are rarely as chaotic as we seem. Even in our darkest acts, we've always been searching for a way to make sense of them, to name the act, to set a price, to write a rule, and sometimes that rule says, this is who we kill. But more often than not, it quietly whispers, this is why we shouldn't. So the next time you see a blood feud in a documentary, or hear of a raid that went too far, or read about a tribe that danced before battle, remember that these weren't instincts, they were systems, they were frameworks, they were choices made by people who lived in a world without courts, without prisons, without treaties, and somehow they still found ways to live together, or die trying. And that brings us to the next question. What happens when those systems start to break? Because after honour comes hierarchy, and after memory comes the state. It began with ice, not war. Or at least that's how we met him. Face down in a glacier, curled like someone mid-fall, arms bent in the last position they would ever hold. He had been there for more than 5,000 years, buried not in earth, but in cold, forgotten by everyone except the mountain. When Ötzi the Iceman was discovered in the year 1991, hikers in the Alps thought they had found a lost climber. No one expected to be face to face with a Copper Age mystery. And no one expected violence. His body was a time capsule, but not a peaceful one. Somewhere around 3250 BCE, this man died alone, or nearly alone, on a high alpine pass, with an arrowhead still lodged deep in his left shoulder and defensive wounds on his hands. He was not a soldier. He had no army, no wall, no grave, but still, he was killed. So what do we do with that? When does a killing become a war? What does one corpse on a mountain say about the world he came from? And what if this isn't just a murder, but the echo of something older? First, what do we actually know? Ötzi's body was preserved by a perfect accident of altitude and weather. Snowfall quickly covered his corpse and the glacier slowly grew over him, preserving not just bone but soft tissue, stomach contents, brain and blood. This allowed for an unparalleled scientific reconstruction of one man's final hours. But more importantly, it opened a window into the world just before writing, cities or formal states. This was not an anonymous skeleton. This was a person with a backstory. Ötzi was around 45 years old, already ancient by the standards of his time. He was short, thin and arthritic. Tattoos, more than 60 of them, lined his joints, possibly for pain relief. His diet, reconstructed from his stomach and gut contents, showed his last meals included red deer, ibex meat, einkorn wheat and bracken. The food was cooked, possibly smoked. He was well fed, but not rested. Pollen analysis revealed he had travelled rapidly from a valley floor up into the high Alps in just a matter of days. He had a deep cut on his hand that was healing poorly, possibly from fending off a blade, and most tellingly, there was an unhealed arrowhead lodged in his shoulder, severing an artery. It likely killed him within minutes. This was not a natural death. But was it personal, political, random? All of these interpretations have been proposed, and all are plausible because Ötzi's world was one of increasing tension. By 3250 BCE, Europe was deep in the Neolithic transformation. Farming had spread, villages dotted valleys, metal was beginning to be smelted, and trade routes across mountain passes were becoming more valuable. But with those changes came new vulnerabilities. Land could now be inherited. Herds could be stolen. Routes could be controlled. Conflict didn't require an army, just a motive. Ötzi carried a toolkit that reveals how precarious this life could be. He had a copper axe, a bow, unfinished, flint-bladed tools, birch bark containers filled with embers, and carefully stitched clothing. His shoes were grass-insulated, his coat was made of multiple animal hides. This was a man prepared to travel, but also ready to defend himself. The copper axe alone was a powerful symbol. At the time, copper tools were rare, valuable, and possibly reserved for high-status individuals. Owning one might make you a target, or a leader, or both. The wounds tell a strange story. The deep gash on his hand, likely a defensive wound, was days old. Not from the moment of death. He had fought someone recently and lived, but then, possibly days later, he was ambushed with an arrow from behind. Whoever fired it didn't retrieve the shaft, and they didn't loot his body. His tools, food, and copper axe were all still there when he fell. This isn't what we expect from a simple robbery. So what does it mean? Some archaeologists propose Ötzi was murdered by a rival or betrayed by a companion. Others suggest clan conflict, a low-scale but persistent form of violence where revenge killings or territory disputes could play out over generations. Still others think he may have been a kind of elite, fleeing a confrontation, dying in retreat. But what unites these theories is their scale. This wasn't war in the sense of pitched battles and regiments, but it may have been the type of violence that lives just beneath the surface of a society, sharp, personal, and impossible to prove centuries later. What makes Ötzi so haunting isn't just his lonely death. It's that he represents a moment in time when human violence was shifting. Organised armies had not yet emerged, but social complexity was rising. The tools of conflict, copper, bows, surplus, were now in place. And yet, here was a man who died not on a battlefield, but in silence. No monument, no memory, just a body in the ice. The absence of others is also telling. No other bodies have been found near him. No signs of group conflict, no burned village or desecrated camp. Ötzi's story, as far as we can tell, is solitary, but that may say more about preservation than reality. Most people in his world died without a glacier to hold their bones. The violence we see may be a tiny frozen tip of a much larger iceberg. But there's something else too, something quieter. Ötzi's body was buried by accident but almost ritually. The snow sealed him, the ice held him. He became, unintentionally, a kind of time-travelling witness, and in his silence, he reminds us that early human violence was not always loud. It could be subtle, slow, creeping. It didn't need a battlefield, just motive, means, and a moment. So what do we do with Ötzi? Was he murdered in a political feud, killed in a hunting dispute, ambushed over trade or territory? Or is this simply the randomness of human fragility magnified by time? The truth is, we don't know. But that's what makes his story so valuable. It is a rare chance to see prehistoric violence not as myth or model, but as a single life, a single death, a frozen question that still has no answer. And maybe that's the most honest thing we can say. Sometimes the past leaves us evidence, but it doesn't always leave us meaning. And in that space, between body and story, between blood and snow, we remember why we ask these questions in the first place. Because war, it seems, does not begin with armies. It begins with someone alone. If violence has always stalked the human story, this is the part where it begins to dress in ceremony, to stand taller, to command. For most of deep time, aggression was small. A thrown rock, an ambush in the reeds, a quiet feud passed down through generations. But around 6,000 years ago, something began to shift. Villages grew teeth, leaders grew taller, and violence itself, once improvised, episodic and personal, started to become something much more dangerous, organised. We're entering the murky period between raid and regiment, between chief and king, between the spontaneous eruption of a quarrel and the careful logistics of a campaign. The evidence is not loud. These are not yet the imperial chronicles of Sargon or Ramses. This is not yet history carved into palace walls. But even in the silence, the outlines begin to appear. Across the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates, in the long ribbon of the Nile, and along the forgotten rivers of the Indus, human groups were becoming something else. Denser, richer, and more strategically aware of power. The very geography may have demanded it. In Mesopotamia, the land itself encouraged rivalry. Fertile soil, yes, but bounded by deserts and shaped by rivers that could flood or vanish. To hold land here was to defend it, and that meant more than walls. It meant coordinated effort, planned patrols, guarded fields, group discipline. In some of the earliest known urban settlements like Eridu and Uruk, we see more than density. We see hierarchy. Buildings that were not just bigger, but elevated. Temples at the centre, with surplus flowing in. And where there is centrality of worship and storage, there is soon control. Archaeologists have long debated how to spot a proto-army before writing. You cannot interview the victors or read the casualty counts. But what you can see are signs of repetition, training, intent. In some layers of Mesopotamian sites, we begin to find standardized weapons, not just utility blades, but forms like socketed spearheads and sling bullets appearing in quantity. This is no longer just a household defending itself. This is supply. Likewise, certain burials begin to shift. In earlier periods, status is hard to read. Beads, tools, perhaps some ochre. But by the 4th millennium BCE, we begin to see graves with prestige weapons, multiple items of the same type, even signs that some individuals had commanded labour in life. Prestige becomes militarized, or perhaps violence becomes prestigious. The lines blur. In Egypt, meanwhile, the pre-dynastic landscape was also transforming. Early Neolithic farmers along the Nile had long organized their lives around the flood. But by around 4000 BCE, a few settlements began to dominate. Places like Hierakonpolis and Nakada grew beyond the scale of subsistence. They accumulated artisans, specialists, storage. And in these larger centres, we find tantalizing clues. Ceremonial maces, elite tombs, wall scenes showing processions of bound captives. It is not yet state propaganda, but it is something close, a visual claim to dominance. And in the Indus, though much of the earliest record lies beneath modern cities or is simply gone, sites like Mehrgarh and later Harappa show a different flavour of complexity. The Indus Valley may not have shouted about violence the way others did, but its very layout suggests control. Grid-like planning, massive granaries, public works. To coordinate that much brick takes authority, and to keep it, likely enforcement. Even without depictions of war, the architecture itself whispers of logistics, surveillance, and probably some form of policing. What connects all of these regions is not just their scale, but the rhythm of control emerging within them. Raids become reprisals, reprisals become routines, routine becomes institution. And somewhere in this spiral, a new figure is born, the commander, not yet a pharaoh, not yet a general, but someone, some few, who begin to speak not just for a group but to deploy them. We cannot yet name these people, their titles have not survived. But in burial goods, in storage ratios, in defensive layers built and rebuilt, we sense their presence. They orchestrated, they counted rations, they selected fighters. Perhaps they were priests, perhaps they were older warriors who had earned obedience. But whatever their shape, the role had begun to form. Leadership sharpened toward conflict. Even religion may have begun to fold itself around this shift. The gods of early Mesopotamia, for instance, did not merely bless the land, they began to demand it. In some of the oldest Sumerian myths, deities issue commands for cities to rise, walls to be built, and enemies to be brought low. Whether these myths emerged from real conquests or inspired them is harder to say, but the concept was seeded that divine favour could justify campaign. We also begin to see increasing investment in mobility, carts, river transport. Even early infrastructure like roads between sites suggests planning beyond the local, not just travel for trade, but routes that would one day serve armies. In this strange twilight between the tribal and the imperial, war was learning how to plan. It was testing blueprints, and what we glimpse in the archaeology of the 4th millennium BCE is not an explosion of battle, but an evolution of control. It is the transition of force from an occasional tool to a formalized power. What makes this period so eerie is how familiar it starts to feel. Elite classes with better graves, weapons that double as status symbols, rituals that blur with executions, surplus that attracts conquest, territories that become sacred not because of any intrinsic value, but because someone drew a line and said this is ours. We are still thousands of years away from phalanxes, scrolls of strategy or golden chariots, but the scaffolding has been set. From here, the next steps will be obvious. Bigger settlements, formal kingship, standing guards, written orders, but that haunting question remains. At what point does protection become projection? At what point does a wall become a challenge? And how many of those first commanders, nameless, faceless, buried in forgotten dust, ever wondered if their cleverness was invention or contagion? Because from this point onward, war will no longer need a reason. It will have systems, and soon those systems will need feeding. Somewhere between the silent ambush and the formal campaign, something irreversible shifted. For hundreds of thousands of years, violence had been episodic. Tensions rose and fell like droughts and floods. People fought in clusters, in personal revenge, in raids that bled into memory but not into stone. But as the 4th millennium BCE drew to a close, the world began to ossify. The rivers were the first to know. On the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia, the rivers Euphrates and Tigris no longer wandered freely. They were measured, diverted, contained. So too, it seems, were people. By around 3500 BCE, we find the faint shadows of a new kind of settlement in the region that would later be called Sumer. These were not mere villages. They were more than kin-based clusters and not yet full-fledged cities. They were dense, hierarchical, productive, and increasingly territorial. Places like Uruk and Eridu, originally loose aggregations of clan compounds and religious centres, had become semi-formalised urban centres with walled precincts and systems of rule. The archaeological record shifts here. We start to see more than just houses and hearths. We see districts, storage complexes, and centralised temples. And then we start to see texts. The earliest known writing, the proto-cuneiform tablets of Uruk, were not poems or prayers. They were ledgers, grain counts, livestock tallies, ration allocations. Bureaucracy, not beauty, was the first to fossilise into script. But it is in these ledgers, these dusty clay slabs, that we glimpse the logistical skeleton of something new. The organised, state-coordinated extraction and redistribution of wealth. And once resources became measurable, they became defendable. And once defendable, they became worth fighting over. Archaeology alone does not show a neat line between raiding and war. But with the emergence of writing, we no longer rely solely on bones or walls. We get glimpses into intent, and in the final centuries before 3000 BCE, those glimpses begin to darken. A tablet from Farah, dated to the late 4th millennium BCE, appears to document a delivery of rations to armed men. It's dry, bureaucratic, and strangely chilling, because the rations are unusually large. Some have interpreted this as a provisioning list for a military force, not a tribal warband, not a kin raid, a standing force, a salaried, state-supported engine of organised violence. There are also early texts from Uruk that include lists of professions. Alongside carpenters and brewers and potters, we find the word for runner, or messenger. Some have speculated this could reference military couriers, people tasked with relaying information across settlements. It's the beginning of something deeply modern, the logistics of warfare. But perhaps the most telling sign comes not from a tablet, but from what the tablets are stored in. At sites like Tel Ukair and Tel Brak, the remains of massive storage buildings, some with administrative seals, doorways with locking mechanisms and centralised distribution rooms, begin to appear around 3200 BCE. These structures were not just about feeding the population. They were about controlling access, controlling loyalty. If food became a tool of administration, it also became a lever for mobilisation. Armies, after all, do not march on promises, they march on calories. And then there's the matter of the wall. Not the symbolic boundary of early villages, but real, engineered, human-made barriers. At the site of Hamuka in northeastern Syria, archaeologists have discovered compelling evidence of organised violence around 3500 BCE, including destroyed structures, charred ruins, and thousands of sling stones scattered across a breach in the city wall. While the exact dates and identity of the attackers remain uncertain, this may represent one of the earliest examples of full-scale urban conflict. Not a raid. A siege. In this final stretch before the Bronze Age, we begin to see the emergence of hierarchy not just as social structure but as military logic. A small class of elite leaders, some divine, some administrative, some both, begin to appear in the archaeological and symbolic record. Statues grow larger, graves become unequal. And in places like Ur and Kish, the first proto-kings begin to appear not only as religious figures, but as military ones. Their symbols are no longer just the horned crown or the cup. They include weapons, maces, standards, the tools of state violence. This is the critical shift. War is no longer something people do. It is something institutions manage, a function, not a failure. And perhaps most hauntingly, something permanent. Raids could stop, vendettas could burn out. But a military class, once formed, had no obvious off-switch. Even architecture reflects this new permanence. In early city layouts of the late Uruk period, we see emerging street systems that channel people through choke points. Walls are no longer defensive improvisations. They are built into the logic of the city. They control not only outsiders but insiders. Surveillance becomes spatial, control becomes architectural, and while the evidence from this period is still partial, fragmentary, biased, incomplete, the trend is unmistakable. Violence has become a system. It has hierarchy, logistics, funding and planning. It is no longer only a reaction to scarcity or revenge. It is a mode of governance. We often like to imagine civilization as the antidote to war. But in Mesopotamia, civilization may have been its organizer. Not the beginning of peace, but the end of spontaneity. From this point onward, war will no longer be occasional. It will be professional. And so the question becomes, when war is managed like grain, when it's counted, rationed and built into the calendar, is it still war? Or has it become something worse, something we forgot how to stop? It's a strange thing to say that war began, as if conflict had a birthday, as if a species once without it suddenly found itself soaked in it, as if a single moment, a buried pit, a painted bow, a broken skull, could mark a turning point when the human story shifted from a life among the living to a life preparing for the dying. But as we close this long, slow journey from 2 million years ago to the rise of early states, the truth is simpler. It may not be that war began, it may be that war grew. And maybe the better question was never when war began, but what changed when we could no longer walk away from it. Across deserts and glaciers, through volcanic winters and green Saharas, something in our nature kept pulling both ways. We had the capacity to form bonds deeper than any other primate, but we also developed the capacity to define who didn't belong. At first it was subtle, shell beads, a line in the dirt, a fire only lit for those you knew. Later it was territorial, the storing of grain, the raising of goats, the first person to say, "This place is mine." And so, perhaps war did not explode into the world with a bang or a plan. Perhaps it seeped in with surplus, with stability, with the tension between love for our own and fear of the other. But we should be careful. There's a long history, especially in the modern West, of explaining war as an inevitable outcome of evolution. The old Hobbesian model, that without government, life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. And so, war was simply our natural state, until kings and states and walls came to keep us in check. But there's another vision, a quieter one. The Rousseauian idea that humans in their early bands were mostly peaceful, that violence came later, with property and politics and the loss of freedom. And while both views contain fragments of truth, neither can fully hold the weight of the archaeological record, because what we actually see in the deep past is a mess. Some groups fought, some didn't. Some built rooftop fortresses without weapons. Others left behind bodies with embedded flint in the spine. Some lived side by side for thousands of years with no sign of trauma. Others were wiped out in single bursts of catastrophic violence. If anything, war seems to be a cultural technology, not a biological inevitability. It spreads, it adapts, it reshapes itself to each new generation's tools and fears. And the evidence suggests that even when humans had the weapons, they didn't always use them. Even when they had the numbers, the surplus, the means, violence was still a decision, not a default. But here's the haunting part. Once war becomes a stable system, a means to control people, acquire wealth, reinforce status or expand territory, it becomes self-sustaining, like fire in dry grass. Once begun, it doesn't have to be started again, just managed, just moved, just inherited. And that may be what we begin to see in the final few millennia of this timeline. Not the invention of violence, but the invention of institutionalized conflict. The point where raids became campaigns, where seasonal vengeance became permanent borders, where warriors became kings, and kings became gods. It's hard to say when exactly that shift locked in. Somewhere between the fortified walls of Tel Es-Sarwan and the early campaigns of proto-states in Mesopotamia, war stopped being a possibility and became a profession, a caste, a calendar event. It no longer needed revenge or resources to begin. It needed only ideology, or ambition, or fear. And from that moment forward, peace would no longer mean the absence of war. It would mean the pause between wars. And so, the idea of a forever war was born. But I want to end not with dread, but with humility. Because for all we've uncovered, the truth is we still know so little. Many early human societies left no trace of violence. Some seem to go to great lengths to resolve tension without it. Others may have developed complex rituals, dances, negotiations, trials by endurance, to avoid the cost of bloodshed. And while we remember the sites where the bones were broken, we forget that silence in the archaeological record can also mean peace, or at least restraint. This has been a long and imperfect journey, a timeline stitched together with flint points, cave walls, and fractured skulls. But I hope, if nothing else, you walk away with a deeper respect for the complexity of our past, and the dangers of oversimplifying it. War is not inevitable. It is not primal. It is not the price of civilization. It is a choice, one made by cultures, not chromosomes. And if it was once invented, then perhaps someday it can be uninvented too. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long, haunted path with me, for tracing the slow emergence of violence across 50 millennia, for sitting with the ambiguity, and for remembering that not every silence in the record means peace, and not every grave means war. If this helped you drift off, helped you study, or helped you slow the noise inside your head, I'm glad you're here. If you think more people should know this story, should sit with it, feel it, question it, then you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before sleep, while walking, or somewhere else I'll never see, in a world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.